Hello, everyone. It's really good to be here and thank you for listening. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old and I work as a traveling physical therapist, which basically means I'm contracted to rotate between rural clinics across the Midwest, filling in wherever there's a staffing gap. And it sounds more glamorous than it is. What it actually means is that I spend an embarrassing portion of my life alone in a car on highways that most GPS systems seem personally offended to acknowledge exist. I want to make something clear before I get into this. I am not the kind of person who believes in the paranormal. Or I should say, I wasn't. I was raised by a mother who was a registered nurse and a father who taught high school chemistry, and between the two of them, I was given a pretty firm foundation in the idea that if something strange happens, there is always a rational explanation waiting around the corner if you're patient enough to look for it. That belief served me well for 30 years. Then October happened, and I'm not sure what I believe anymore. At the time of the incident, I was driving back from a clinic in a small town called Millhaven, which sits about 90 miles outside of Des Moines, Iowa. I'd been working a 12-day stretch covering for a therapist who had gone on emergency medical leave, and that evening I had just finished treating my last patient of the day, a 74-year-old farmer recovering from a hip replacement who, bless him, had refused to do his exercises all week, and then acted surprised when his range of motion hadn't improved. By the time I packed my equipment, returned the company car key to the front desk, signed out and actually got on the road, it was a little after 11 at night. My apartment was in Ames, which under normal circumstances is a drive of roughly an hour and 40 minutes. That night, though, the conditions were far from normal. A storm had been building since mid-afternoon, and by the time I merged onto Route 30, it had opened up completely. The kind of Iowa rain that comes in horizontal sheets and turns headlights into something more decorative than functional. I remember turning the radio up louder than I needed to because the silence underneath it felt heavier than usual, and the wipers on the rental car I was driving weren't fully keeping up. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand that I had every reason in the world to already be on edge before any of this started. I was tired, I was driving in bad weather on a road I didn't know well, and it had been about 6 weeks since my father passed away from a cardiac event, which is still very fresh. I mention him because he becomes relevant later, and because it's important to understand that I was already in a somewhat fragile state of mind. I don't say that as an excuse, I say it because it's honest. It was somewhere between mile marker 47 and 48 around 11:40 at night when I saw him. At first I thought it was a deer. Your brain does that on dark rural roads. It sees a shape and immediately reaches for the most familiar explanation. But the shape was too tall and too upright, and by the time my brain caught up to what my eyes were actually seeing, I had already slammed the brakes so hard that the back of the car fishtailed slightly on the wet asphalt before straightening out. My heart was absolutely hammering. Standing in my lane, not on the shoulder, in my lane, was a man. He was facing me head-on, caught in my headlights like a deer himself, one arm raised with his palm out as if asking me to stop, which, in fairness, I almost hadn't. I came within what felt like 15 feet of him before the car stopped moving. For a moment, neither of us moved. The rain was hammering the roof of the car, and I couldn't see him clearly through the water sheeting down the windshield, but I could see the silhouette of him, tall, lean, wearing what appeared to be a dark jacket. He lowered his arm slowly. Then he walked around to the passenger side of the car. Everything in my training as a solo female traveler said to lock the door and drive, and I know that I've had that conversation with myself 100 times in the abstract. But there are abstractions, and then there is a real human being standing in the pouring rain on an empty highway at midnight, and in that moment the calculus changes in ways that are hard to explain unless you've been there. He was alone. There were no other cars on the road. The nearest town was at least 12 miles back. I unlocked the door. He got in. He appeared to be somewhere in his mid to late 40s with dark hair that was graying at the temples and a face that was composed and calm in a way that I found both reassuring and oddly out of place given the situation. He was wearing dark slacks, a navy blue fleece jacket and work boots, regular clothes, nothing alarming. "I'm sorry to scare you," he said. His voice was low and even, not breathless or panicked the way you'd expect from someone who had just been nearly hit by a car. "My truck went off the road about a mile back. I've been walking for a while." "Are you hurt?" I asked. "No," he said and smiled slightly. "I'm fine. I just need to get to Halverson. There's a gas station there. I can make some calls." Halverson was a small community about 14 miles up the road, which I had passed through on my way to Millhaven, I knew had a 24-hour truck stop just off the main road. It was on my way. I told him I'd take him there. I pulled back onto the road, and for a few minutes neither of us spoke. I had turned the radio down when he got in, a reflex, and now the silence felt oddly comfortable rather than tense. I was watching him from the corner of my eye, the way you do when you're trying not to be obvious about it. The wipers were still working and the rain was still coming down hard. Awful night to be outside, I said, because I felt the need to say something. It is, he agreed. Then, you just came from Millhaven. It wasn't a question. I assumed he'd seen the clinic's parking pass on the dashboard. I'd forgotten to take it off, so I didn't find it particularly strange. Yeah, long week, I said. Physical therapy, right? For the rural clinics? That one gave me a small pause. The parking pass just said the clinic name, not the specialty. But the clinic in Millhaven was a general rehabilitation center, and it wasn't a stretch for someone familiar with the area to know what they did there. I told myself that. You sound tired, he said. I am, I admitted. I've been out here for almost 2 weeks. He nodded, looking straight ahead through the windshield. Hard to be away from home for that long, especially lately. I didn't respond to that. There was something about the way he said especially lately that pulled at something in my chest, but I couldn't place it, and I didn't want to invite a conversation about my father with a stranger in my car at midnight, so I let it go. The miles ticked by. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 11:52. The rain had lightened up very slightly, or maybe I was just getting used to it. I remember noticing how quiet he was. Not uncomfortable quiet, just still. He had his hands resting in his lap and he wasn't looking at his phone or fidgeting or doing any of the things that passengers normally do when they're nervous or bored. He was just sitting there looking at the road ahead. At some point I turned the heater up slightly because I figured he had to be cold and wet. That was when I noticed something that I filed away without fully processing in the moment. He wasn't wet. I don't mean damp, but starting to dry. I mean that when I glanced over at him, his jacket didn't have the dark saturation of soaked fabric. His hair wasn't plastered to his head. His hands resting in his lap were dry, not just the hands, the sleeves, the collar, all of it. He looked like someone who had walked from a warm house and gotten into a car, not someone who had been standing in a downpour. I noticed it and then I set it aside because my brain offered me an explanation before I could even ask the question. Maybe the jacket was waterproof, maybe his hair doesn't show it, and maybe it's dark and you can't see clearly. All of those things felt plausible enough that I accepted them without pushing further. That's what our minds do. That's what my mind did. Take the Grover Road exit, he said. I glanced at the upcoming sign, Grover Road. I didn't recognize the name. I thought you wanted to go to Halverson, I said. That exit's another few miles up. This is faster, he said. Grover Road connects about 2 miles down. You'll see. I had no reason to doubt him. He presumably knew the area better than I did. He'd said his truck had gone off the road back there, which implied he traveled that route regularly. I took the exit. Grover Road was narrower than Route 30 and unlit with trees pressing close on both sides. The kind of road that feels like it was made for daytime and tolerates nighttime only reluctantly. I slowed down significantly. Just stay on this road, he said. We drove in silence for a couple of minutes. The rain had dropped to a soft, steady patter, and I could hear it more clearly now without the noise of the highway. At some point, I realized that I had been recording a voice memo. I do this habitually when I'm driving and want to note something about a patient before I forget. And it had been recording since before I'd picked him up. I didn't mention it. I just noted it and kept driving. Your father, he said. I looked at him. He wanted you to know he's not in pain anymore. He said it the same way he'd said everything else, calmly, without preamble, without the tentative tone of someone floating a sensitive topic, just a statement of fact. He said you've been blaming yourself for not being there when it happened. The car felt very cold all of a sudden. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, and I'm not proud of it, but my voice came out thin and strange. You were in Wichita on contract, he said. You were doing your job. He knew that. He was proud of that. He paused. His name was Gerald. I pulled the car over. I don't remember making the decision. The car just stopped and my hands were gripping the wheel and I was staring straight ahead and everything, the road, the trees, the rain on the windshield, was blurring in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. How do you know my father's name? I asked. When I turned to look at him, the passenger seat was empty. Not in the way that someone gets out of a car when you're not looking. The door hadn't opened. There had been no movement, no sound, no displacement of the air the way there would be if a person had shifted and exited. He was simply gone. The seat was empty and the seatbelt was neatly in its holder as if it had never been touched. I sat there for what felt like a long time but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. Then I turned the car around and drove back to Route 30 as fast as I felt safe doing, got back on the highway and drove directly to the Halverson truck stop. I don't think I breathed normally until I saw the lights of the place. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. When I finally felt steady enough, I walked in and asked the woman at the counter, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, if I could speak to someone from the county sheriff's office. She looked at me for a moment and picked up the phone. A deputy arrived about 20 minutes later. I told him the whole story. I gave him a description of the man, told him where I had picked him up, described the Grover Road exit, described the jacket and the boots. The deputy listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. And when I finished, he asked me a few clarifying questions. Then he turned a page in his notebook and was quiet for a moment. He told me that the stretch of Route 30 around mile markers 45 through 49 had what he called a history. Not accidents exactly, or not just accidents. He said that over the years there had been multiple reports from drivers who had picked up a passenger in that stretch who then disappeared from a moving vehicle, and that the descriptions were consistent enough that they had documented them. Dark jacket, grey at the temples, calm manner, knew things he shouldn't have known. He said the reports had started around 12 years ago, not long after a man named Patrick Wren, 47 years old, had gone off the road in that exact area during a rainstorm and died before anyone could reach him. He had been trying to flag down help. He showed me a photograph from a county record. It was a driver's license photo, low resolution and slightly faded, but clear enough. It was him. I went back to my car after the deputy left and I sat there for a long time. Eventually I remembered the voice memo and played it back. You could hear the rain and my voice asking if he was hurt, saying I'd take him to Halverson, remarking that it was an awful night to be outside. All of it was there, but where his voice should have been, answering my questions, there was only silence, just my half of the conversation talking into empty air. I've thought about it every day since then. I've looked up Patrick Wren and found the accident report, the obituary, the photograph that matched the man who sat in my car. I've thought about what he said about my father, about Gerald, about not being in pain anymore, and I've turned it over and over the way you turn a stone looking for something underneath it. I don't have an explanation. I spent the first week after it happened convincing myself I'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the whole encounter. But there are two things that prevent me from landing on that. The first is the voice memo. The second is that the morning after it happened, I found the passenger seat of that rental car was completely, entirely dry, even though the rain had been coming down that hard and he'd gotten in off a wet highway. The car was wet everywhere else. The floor mat on the passenger side was bone dry. My mother, the registered nurse, the empiricist, told me when I finally told her the story that grief can do strange things to the mind and that I needed to be gentle with myself and give it time. Maybe she's right. I really want her to be right. But I still can't listen to that voice memo. I've tried twice and I don't think I'll try a third time. Some things are harder to explain away than others, and I've found that I'm not as committed to finding rational explanations as I used to be. If you're ever driving Route 30 late at night and it's raining, I'm not going to tell you not to help someone who needs it. I don't think I would do anything differently, honestly, even knowing what I know now. What I will say is this: before you let someone in, take a good look at whether the rain is touching them, because if it isn't, well, that's a conversation you're going to be thinking about for a long time. Thank you for listening, everyone. Take care of yourselves out there. We continue. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been running cranes along the Gulf Coast for going on 23 years. I'm 51 now. Started when I was 28 on a refinery expansion outside Beaumont, Texas. Didn't know a thing about the work except that it paid 3 times what I was making at the feed store. My foreman at the time, a man named Dale who chewed tobacco from sunup to sundown, put me in a cab and said, "Son, the one rule is don't drop anything. Everything else you can learn." I learned everything else. I worked refineries, I worked bridge construction. I worked offshore platform assembly on barges out in the Gulf. I've lifted beams the size of school buses and set them down within half an inch of where the engineer wanted them. It's not a glamorous job. People don't know your name, and they see the finished bridge or the finished building, and they don't think about the man who spent 14 hours a day in a cab, the size of a phone booth, doing the most precise and dangerous work in the whole operation. But I was never bitter about it. That work bought us a house in Nederland, Texas, put my older boy through Texas State, and right now is keeping my younger son in his second year of engineering at UT Austin. My wife Sandra has never had to worry about the electricity bill, not once in 20 years. I'm proud of that. I want to tell you what happened to me about 4 years ago. I don't tell this story easily, and I'm going to ask you to hold your judgment until the end, because I know how it sounds. I know how all of it sounds. It was late October, and I was working a major expansion project on a chemical plant south of Port Arthur. 300-foot tower crane, industrial lifting work, 12-hour shifts. We were behind schedule because a subcontractor had delivered the wrong anchor bolts for the secondary column. I won't bore you with the details, and the foreman was pushing everyone hard to make up lost time. I had been working 10 days straight, not 10 8-hour days, 10 12-hour days, some of them going longer. I don't say that to excuse what happened, I say it because it matters. A crane operator running on 4 hours of sleep is as dangerous as a drunk driver, and everyone in the industry knows this, and nobody does anything about it when there's a schedule to keep. I was bringing down a spreader bar 4,000 pounds of steel rigging hardware from the second hook point. Routine lift. I had done this particular movement probably 40 times on that job site alone. But on the 41st time, something went wrong with the secondary brake mechanism on the ladder access hatch I had propped open for ventilation. The hatch swung loose in a gust off the Gulf, struck my control console, and the shock knocked me backward. I went through the open access door of the cab. I fell 38 feet. I know it was 38 because the OSHA inspector measured it afterward. To give you a sense of scale, that's a 4-story building. A man who falls from a 4-story building has roughly a 30% chance of surviving. I survived because I hit a temporary scaffolding platform that had been installed the week before, a platform that, by all rights, should not still have been there. The subcontractor had missed its scheduled removal by 5 days. His delay, which had frustrated everyone on the project, is the reason I am alive. I broke 7 ribs, my left collarbone, my left forearm in 2 places, and I fractured 3 vertebrae in my lower back. I was in the hospital for 11 days and in a rehabilitation program for 4 months after that. Sandra barely left my side for those 11 days. She slept in the chair next to my bed and ate vending machine sandwiches and didn't complain once. My sons drove in on weekends. The older one, Tyler, tried hard not to show how scared he was. The younger one, Cole, didn't try at all. He just held my hand and cried, and I think I love him the most for that, for not pretending. I came back to work 7 months after the accident. Getting back into a crane cab was one of the hardest things I've ever done. My body had healed, but something in my mind hadn't caught up. Every time the cab swayed in the wind, which it does, which is completely normal, which it has always done, my heart would seize like a fist was squeezing it. I gripped the controls harder than I needed to. I ran lifts 10% slower than spec. My superintendent pulled me aside in the 3rd week and said without cruelty that I should think hard about whether this was still the right job for me. I told him to give me time. He did. And he was right to, because by the 4th month back, I had found something close to my old self again. The fear never left completely, I don't think it ever does, but I learned to work alongside it. The way you learn to work alongside a nagging joint pain that's always there but doesn't stop you. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. The first time it happened, I was riding to the job site at 5:30 in the morning in my truck. The sky was that dark purple-gray it gets before the sun properly rises, and the road out to the plant was empty except for me and the occasional 18-wheeler running east. I had the radio on low, a country station out of Beaumont. I glanced at the passenger side window. There was a man falling, and not outside the window, I mean, that's what my brain showed me, a full and complete image of a man in a yellow hard hat and orange vest falling from height, arms out, the posture of someone who has just realized there is nothing below them. The image lasted maybe 2 seconds, then it was gone, and there was just the dark road and the radio. I pulled over. Sat there for 5 minutes with my hands on the wheel. I told myself it was a half dream, a hypnagogic flash I had read about those in a pamphlet at the rehabilitation clinic, how the brain sometimes projects waking dream images during periods of fatigue or stress. I told myself that and drove the rest of the way to the site. 3 days later, a rigger named Pete Galloway fell from a secondary platform on the east side of the structure we were working on. He dropped 22 feet, landed wrong, and shattered his pelvis. He lived, but he never worked construction again. I sat in my cab after they called the ambulance and looked at my own hands for a long time. The second time was 6 weeks later. This one I saw in the rearview mirror of my truck as I was pulling out of the company yard after a shift. A flash of a man in a white shirt, not work clothes, being struck by something large and mechanical. It was gone before I could make sense of it. The image was more violent than the first, and I felt sick in a way I couldn't explain. 9 days later, I saw the story on the local news. A civilian contractor performing routine maintenance on a conveyor system at a grain elevator in Groves had been caught by a restarted belt. The description of what he was wearing, white button-down shirt, he had come from a meeting before the shift, made the hair on my arms stand straight up. I didn't tell Sandra. I didn't want her to worry. I had started seeing a counselor after the accident, a calm woman named Dr. Reyes who specialized in occupational trauma, and I told her about the visions during our next session. She said what therapists say. Trauma can produce vivid, intrusive imagery. The mind sometimes creates false pattern recognition. These experiences can feel prophetic without being so. Confirmation bias. I nodded and said that made sense and drove home and sat in the dark in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. I wanted her to be right. The third vision came on a Tuesday night in November, and this one I was not in any vehicle, half asleep or otherwise distracted. I was standing in the yard behind my house, burning brush in the fire pit Sandra and I had built the previous spring. The air smelled like cedar and dry leaves. The sky was clear and full of stars. I was having a genuinely good evening. I looked into the fire. And in the fire I saw the cab of a tower crane, the specific cab of the Liebherr unit I operated every day, engulfed from below. Not a fire spreading up to it. A fire starting at the base of the tower and consuming the entire structure within seconds, moving with a speed that no real fire moves. And inside the cab I saw a figure in the operator's seat. The figure turned toward me. I could not see the face clearly through the smoke and the glass, but I saw the left hand. I saw the wedding ring on the fourth finger, the one Sandra had placed there 22 years ago, a simple gold band I had never once removed. The figure beat against the glass. The cab exploded. I was on my knees in the grass, and I don't know when I got there. Sandra came out through the back door, alarmed by some sound I must have made, and I told her I had slipped on the wet ground. She believed me. I needed her to believe me. I will not describe the weeks that followed except to say that I became a different kind of person. I ran pre-shift safety checks that lasted 45 minutes instead of the standard 10. I refused to operate in wind conditions above 15 miles per hour, which is a full 10 miles below the rated safety threshold. I carried a fire extinguisher in the cab, which is not regulation equipment for that position. My superintendent spoke to me twice, then formally. I was burning through goodwill I had spent years building, and I couldn't explain why. My co-worker and friend Darnell, we had worked together for 8 years, and I trust him more than almost anyone, noticed the change and asked me directly what was wrong one evening over dinner at a diner off the highway. He was not a man who asked such things lightly. I told him, all of it. The visions, the 2 that came true, the third one in the fire with the ring. Darnell is a practical man. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Marcus, I have to ask you something. Did all of this start after your fall?" I told him yes. He nodded slowly. He said he had heard of this before, not often, not as something people talked about openly, but he said that in his experience, the men who survive the worst accidents sometimes come back with something that didn't leave with them when they got out of the hospital. He said he thought it might be worth talking to a man named Leonard Greer, a retired rigger who had worked the Gulf platforms in the 80s and 90s and was now living somewhere outside of Vidor. He said Leonard had gone through something similar years ago, and that he didn't talk about it publicly, but that he might talk to me. I asked Darnell how he knew about Leonard. He looked at his coffee and said, "Because of how he lives now. You'll understand when you see him." Leonard Greer lived in a small clapboard house at the end of a gravel road about 12 miles outside of Vidor, surrounded by East Texas pines so tall and dense they made the house feel like it sat at the bottom of a canyon. The yard was immaculate, not in the way of a man who takes pride in it, but in the way of a man who maintains things because maintenance is the only routine left. There were no decorations, no lawn chairs, and no garden, just a clean, flat, empty space. He came to the door before I knocked. He looked at me for a long moment. I had expected an old man. He was not old, not by his actual years, which I later found out were 58. But there was something in his face that made him look like a man who had run out of something essential a very long time ago. Not energy, not health. Something I don't have a clean word for. I told him my story. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "The vision with your ring, that's when you came here." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want to know if there's a way out?" I said, "Yes." He let me in. Leonard told me that after his own accident, a crane collapsed in 1994 on a platform 30 miles offshore that killed 3 men and should have killed him. He had experienced the same progression. Visions that came true. Escalation. Then the vision of himself. He had sought out a man who pointed him toward a specific ritual, performed at midnight, which he described only in general terms. He said the ritual was a negotiation. He said the outcome was that his death, which had been approaching, receded. He had lived 30 more years beyond what he should have. But, he said, he showed me his living room, a couch, a television, a table with a single coffee mug on it, washed and dried and placed there with no particular care. There were no photographs anywhere. There had been photographs once you could see the faint rectangular shadows on the paint where frames had hung for years and then been taken down. "My wife's name was Carol," he said. "She left 12 years ago. My daughter calls on my birthday. She calls because she feels she should, not because she wants to. The last time she came to visit, the last time I let her come. I should say she cried the whole drive home. I know because she told a mutual friend. She said being with me was like sitting in a room with a body." He let that land. "I'm not telling you I feel pain about this," he continued. "That's what I'm trying to explain to you. I don't feel pain about it. I don't feel anything about it. I know the way you know an arithmetic fact that those were the people I loved most in the world. I cannot access that love anymore. It isn't there. The ritual extended my life, and the cost was everything that makes a life worth living. He told me to go home, and he told me to take out a life insurance policy, large enough to keep Sandra and the boys stable for a decade, and to drive carefully, and to accept what was coming. The 30 years I've had since Carol left," he said, standing at his door as I left. "Those aren't 30 years of living. That's 30 years of waiting to be done. Don't do this." I drove home. I sat in the driveway again. I thought about Cole crying in the hospital room, holding my hand. I thought about Sandra sleeping in that chair for 11 nights. I thought about Tyler, who had driven 4 hours one way every Saturday for 8 weeks during my rehab, without being asked, without making a thing of it. I called Dr. Reyes in the morning and cancelled my appointment. I made a phone call back to Leonard and asked for the details he had withheld. He gave them to me, reluctantly and with one final repetition of his warning, which I heard but did not listen to. I performed the ritual 3 nights later, alone, in an open field off Highway 87 near the coast at midnight. I will not describe what I saw or what I agreed to. I will say that Leonard was right about one thing he had mentioned only briefly. Whatever you face in that hour is not a symbol or a metaphor. It is something that sees you precisely and completely, and the experience of being seen that clearly by something that old and that indifferent is not something you come back from unchanged in some minor way. I came back changed in a major way. The vision stopped. I returned to full operating capacity at work. My superintendent was relieved. Sandra said I seemed more like myself. I ran my cranes well and carefully and without incident. For 3 months I believed that I had beaten the cost somehow, that I was different from Leonard, that what he had lost I would be able to hold on to. The first thing I lost was music. I had always loved music not as a hobby, but in the deep way some people do, where the right song at the right moment can crack something open in your chest. That stopped. Not gradually. It stopped the way a light stops when you cut the power. I drove to work in silence because the radio produced nothing in me anymore. Then food. Then the satisfaction of a clean, precise lifted thing I had been proud of for 2 decades. Then the pleasure of cold water after a hot day. These things happened over about 6 weeks, and I watched them go the way you watch objects receding in a rear-view mirror, knowing they are moving away, but unable to do anything about it. Sandra noticed first. She is not a woman who misses things. She asked me one evening if I was depressed, and I said no, because depressed implies suffering, and what I was experiencing was not suffering. It was the absence of everything that suffering and joy are made of. She cried. I watched her cry and understood with perfect clarity that this was a woman I had loved deeply, and that I no longer felt that love in any way I could reach or locate. I knew the fact of it. I could not feel the fact of it. I tried to tell her I loved her. The words came out correctly. She knew they were hollow. Sandra has always known when I am genuine and when I am not. That has always been one of the things I treasured most about her. I don't treasure it anymore. I've been in this rented house outside of Lumberton for 14 months now. I made sure Sandra had what she needed before I left. I won't speak to the details, but she is stable. Tyler and Cole know that something happened to their father, though not what. Cole called 3 weeks ago. It was a good conversation by external measure. He told me about a project he was working on for his structures class. I responded appropriately. I asked the right questions. When I hung up, I sat and tried to find in myself the feeling of a father proud of his son, and I could not find it, and that is how I know, beyond any reasoning, that what Leonard told me was completely true and that I should have listened. I work occasional jobs. I sleep a regular number of hours. I eat without hunger or pleasure, out of maintenance. I take walks in the morning because the body requires movement. I watch the sun rise over the pines, and I know intellectually that it is beautiful. I feel nothing about it. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because Leonard told it to me, and it didn't change my choice. And maybe it won't change yours either, if you ever find yourself in that field at midnight with that decision in front of you. But Leonard told me anyway, and I understood later why. Because when you are where I am now, there is nothing left to do but pass the warning forward. There are worse things than dying at the right time. I know that now. I knew it too late. We continue. I want to tell you something that happened about 6 years ago. I've never been able to shake it, and I've thought about it almost every single day since. It was the most extraordinary thing I've ever experienced in my 42 years on this earth, stranger than any storm I've ever ridden out, stranger than anything I'd ever read in a book or seen in a movie. And trust me, after 18 years on commercial fishing boats in Alaska, I've seen plenty of things that would make most people's hair stand on end. I grew up in Seattle, Washington. My father, Richard, worked on the floor of a Boeing assembly plant in Everett. He was a quiet man, steady and hardworking, the kind of man who never missed a day's work in 30 years and never once complained about it. What he truly loved was fishing. On weekends he'd take me and my younger sister out on Puget Sound in a second-hand aluminum skiff, and those were the best mornings of my childhood. He taught me how to read the tides, how to tie a proper knot, and how to respect the water. My mother wanted me to go to college, and for a few years I tried. I spent 2 uninspiring semesters at the University of Washington before I couldn't take it anymore. I drifted for a while, construction jobs, warehouse work, until my Uncle Cal, my father's older brother, offered me a spot on his halibut boat operating out of Kodiak, Alaska. I was 24 years old and I said yes without a second thought. My mother never fully forgave either of us. I fell in love with it immediately. The vastness of the Gulf of Alaska, the cold that gets into your bones in a way that's almost spiritual. The silence that exists out there when the engine cuts and there's nothing around you for 100 miles in every direction. There's a freedom to it that I've never been able to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. My father died when I was 32. He'd gone out alone on a Saturday morning in his old skiff on Puget Sound. A sudden squall came up without much warning. The Coast Guard found the overturned boat near the entrance to Hood Canal the following morning. They never recovered his body. I took a week off from the boat, went home to Seattle to be with my mother and sister, and then I went back to work because I didn't know what else to do. The water, oddly enough, was the only place where I felt close to him after that. The trip I want to tell you about happened in late September. It was the tail end of halibut season, and we were doing what would be one of our last runs of the year, a 72-hour trip out of Homer, Alaska. We were aboard a 60-foot boat called the Celeste, which I'd been working on for the previous 3 seasons. There were 3 of us on board. Captain Grace Harmon, who had 22 years of commercial fishing experience and ran a tight professional operation. Cole Briggs, our deckhand and engineer, 28 years old and in his 2nd year of full-time fishing, and me. Grace was a formidable woman, compact and strong, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of calm, certain manner that inspires confidence in other people during bad situations. She'd grown up in Valdez and had seen the aftermath of the '89 oil spill as a teenager, an experience she said had shaped everything about how she thought about the ocean. Cole was a good kid from Fairbanks, still learning but eager and unafraid of hard work. I liked both of them very much. The first day and a half went exactly as planned. Good weather, reasonable seas, decent fishing. We filled about 40% of our hold with halibut by the morning of the second day, which put us on track for a strong run. Then, around 3 in the afternoon on day 2, the fog came. It wasn't unusual to see fog out there, it came with the territory. But this was different from anything I'd experienced in 18 years. It didn't roll in gradually the way fog normally does. It arrived almost instantaneously, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the ocean. One moment we had 30 miles of visibility, and the next we were encased in a dense grey-white wall that reduced our sight range to less than 50 feet. "That's a fast one," Cole said, leaning out of the wheelhouse door. Grace said nothing. She tightened her grip on the wheel, cut our speed, checked the radar, and tried the radio. We got a weather report from Kodiak that indicated some fog in our sector, but nothing unusual. We slowed down and pushed through it, expecting it to thin out. It didn't thin out, it got denser. By 5 o'clock, the radar had started to behave strangely, the return signals flickering and fragmenting in ways that made no sense given what should have been open water all around us. Grace called the Coast Guard station in Homer to report our position and the unusual conditions. She got through initially, exchanged a few words, and then the signal disintegrated into static. "Probably atmospheric interference," she said, though she didn't look entirely convinced. What happened next is harder to explain. Sometime around 6 or 7 in the evening, I lost precise track of time, which itself was strange. The ocean went completely flat. Not calm in the normal sense, but absolutely perfectly still. No swells, no chop, not even the gentle rolling that the Celeste maintains as a kind of baseline rhythm, even in the quietest conditions. The water around us was like a pane of dark glass. I've been on the water for nearly 2 decades. I've never seen anything like it. You could have dropped a pebble from the bow, and the ripples would have been the only movement on the surface for as far as you could see through that fog. "Grace," I said. "I see it," she said quietly. We cut the engine entirely. The silence that followed was absolute. No engine, no wave action against the hull, no wind, nothing. Cole and I stood on the deck, and I think we were both a little afraid to speak. The fog pressed in around us like something with weight to it. We tried everything: GPS, the satellite phone, the emergency beacon. The GPS was giving us a position that placed us approximately 40 miles from where our own charts and dead reckonings said we should be. The satellite phone connected to nothing. The emergency beacon activated, but we had no way of knowing if anyone received the signal. "There's something over there," Cole said, pointing off the starboard bow. He was right. Through the fog, in a direction that should have been open ocean, there was a faint amber glow, distant and diffuse, like light filtered through something dense. It wasn't a vessel. Vessel lights are precise and directional. This was something larger, something fixed. Grace studied it for a long time without speaking. "That's not on any chart I've ever seen," she finally said. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She was quiet for another minute. Then, "Start the engine. We'll approach slowly." It took us almost an hour to find our way through that fog toward the light. The water remained completely still the entire time, which allowed Grace to move us forward at an almost walking pace. Gradually, the glow resolved itself into something coherent. The lighted windows of several small structures on a rocky shoreline and a weathered wooden dock extending into the water. The island, if that's the right word for it, was small. From what I could see, it was perhaps a quarter mile across, a low, dark shape of rock and scrubby vegetation rising out of that flat, impossible sea. There was a cluster of perhaps 8 or 10 buildings, all of them simple and old-looking, their windows lit with a warm and steady light that reminded me of kerosene lamps. We tied up at the dock. Grace looked at Cole and me with an expression that was equal parts confusion and professional caution. "Stay together," she said. We stepped off the boat and onto the dock. The wood was solid underfoot, old but well-maintained. The air here was different from the open ocean, still cold, but somehow softer, without the salt edge that I always associate with the Gulf of Alaska. There were no sounds, no birds, no wind, no water moving against any shore. We walked up the dock toward the buildings. The ground between them was rough grass and gravel. I noticed that everything seemed slightly aged, but not abandoned, more like a place that had always existed a little bit outside of ordinary time. I'm aware of how that sounds. I don't have a better way to say it. Cole stopped walking first. He was staring at a small building on our left, a low structure with a single lighted window. His face had gone pale in the way that has nothing to do with cold. "That's my grandfather's truck," he said. Parked beside the building was an old blue Ford pickup from the early 90s, with a particular dent above the rear passenger wheel well. I watched Cole walk toward it and place his hand on the hood almost reverently, the way you touch something you were sure was gone forever. "He had a sticker on the tailgate," Cole said, his voice barely holding together. "Oregon Coast. He put it there the summer before he died." He walked around to the back of the truck. I followed him. There was a faded blue and white sticker on the tailgate. Oregon Coast. Before either of us could say another word, the door of the building opened, and an older man stepped out, 70s, heavy-set, with a full white beard and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Cole made a sound I had never heard from him before, something between a gasp and a sob, and he walked forward as the old man opened his arms. "Pop," Cole said. "Pop, is that really you?" I turned away to give him some privacy, and when I looked back at Grace, she was no longer beside me. I found her 20 yards away, standing completely still in front of one of the other buildings. A younger man, perhaps mid-30s, with Grace's same square jaw and direct eyes, stood in the doorway. Grace had both hands pressed over her mouth. "Kevin," she whispered. It came out barely as a word at all. I didn't know much about Grace's personal life. She kept it private, but I knew she'd had a younger brother who had died of cancer some years before. I kept walking, careful not to intrude. I went to the far end of the settlement, past the last building, to where a flat, rocky shelf extended out into the black water. There was someone sitting there on an overturned wooden crate, working with his hands. As I got closer, I could see he was untangling a hand line, not a commercial rig, but the simple kind my father had used on those Saturday mornings on the Sound when I was a boy. I stopped walking when I was about 15 feet away. He looked up. I have tried to write this moment in my head hundreds of times over the last 6 years, and I still don't have adequate words for it. It was my father, not a memory of my father, not a vision or a trick of the fog. My father with the same hands I'd watched tie 1,000 knots, the same slight tilt of his head when he looked at someone, the same steady presence that had always made me feel, as a child, that everything would be all right. I sat down on the rock beside him. I couldn't speak for a long time, and he seemed to understand that, the way he always had understood things like that without needing them explained. We sat together in the silence. Eventually I put my arms around him and held on, and he held on back, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the week they found his overturned boat on the Sound. "I've missed you," I finally managed to say. "I know," he said. "I've been watching." We talked. I don't know how long. It felt like a long time and also like no time at all. I asked him questions I'd been carrying for years, and he answered some of them. He told me he was all right. He told me the water hadn't been a bad way to go, that in the end there had been something peaceful about it, something that surprised him. He told me not to worry. Then he said, "You need to go back to your boat." "I don't want to," I said. "I know," he said, "but it's not your time yet. You have things left to do." He looked at me with that particular steadiness of his, the expression I'd been carrying in my memory for 10 years. "Grace and the boy, they've made their choice. That's not yours to carry. Go back to the boat, Nathan. Go back now." I looked at him for a long time. He held my gaze without wavering. "Will I find this place again?" I asked. "When it's time," he said. "Yes." He stood up with me and walked me back along the waterfront toward the dock. We didn't speak. At the point where the dock began, he stopped. I kept walking. I did not look back because I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be able to make myself keep moving. I found Cole first. He was standing outside the building where he'd found his grandfather, and when he looked at me, his eyes were red, but his face carried an expression I'd never seen on him before, something like the relief of setting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was there. "I'm staying," he said quietly before I could say a word. "I know how that sounds. I can't explain it any better than that, but I'm staying. I nodded. I didn't try to argue. I found Grace sitting with her brother on the steps of his building. She looked up when she heard me approach, and she already knew what I was going to say. Don't, she said, not unkindly. I know what you're about to tell me. You should go, but I'm not going with you. She paused for a moment, watching me steadily. You're the best fisherman I've ever worked with, Nathan. Take the Celeste and head back the way we came. The fog will clear. I wanted to say more. I didn't find the words for it. I shook her hand, and she surprised me. She pulled me into a brief, fierce hug that lasted only a second. Then she released me and turned back to her brother. I walked back to the Celeste alone. I started the engine and untied the lines. I eased the boat backward away from the dock, then turned her bow into the fog and pushed the throttle forward. The water was still glassy and still. I steered by feel and by instinct in the direction I believed we'd come from. The fog began to thin. A slow, deep swell returned beneath the hull, and the Celeste began to move the way she was meant to move. I felt the first breath of real wind on my face. I remember thinking we were almost through. After that, nothing, until I opened my eyes in a hospital room in Anchorage. A Coast Guard rescue swimmer came to see me on my second day in the hospital and told me what he knew. The Celeste had been found drifting approximately 8 miles southeast of Shuyak Island in the early morning hours of October 1st by another fishing vessel that reported her running without lights and with no one visible at the helm. I was found on the aft deck, unconscious, with severe hypothermia and blunt force injuries to my head and left side consistent, the doctor said, with being thrown hard against the interior of the wheelhouse during an impact event. A rogue wave was the most likely cause, though no one could say with certainty. There was no sign of Grace or Cole, no sign anywhere. They were listed as lost at sea. Their families were notified. A small service was held in Homer at the end of the month, and I attended it, and I stood at the back of the room and kept everything I've just told you entirely to myself. I've been asked many times since by the Coast Guard investigators, by the fishing company, and by friends who saw how quiet I got after it happened, what I remember about those last hours on the water. I've never told anyone the full version until now. I was afraid of how it would sound. But I've spent 6 years turning it over in my mind, and I've come to a kind of peace with it. I believe that Grace and Cole are somewhere they wanted to be. I don't think they suffered, and I don't think they were lost in any real sense of the word. I think they found exactly what they needed in that place without a name on any chart. That small settlement on the flat water where the fog had no business being and the lights burned warm and steady in the dark. I'm still fishing. I work out of Kodiak now, on a different boat, and I still love the Gulf of Alaska the way I've always loved it. Some days, when the ocean goes quiet and the light changes in a particular way and the horizon disappears into gray, I look out over the water and I think I understand something about what's waiting out there, beyond the edge of the visible world. I'm not afraid of it. My father will be on that dock when it's my time, untangling his line in that patient, unhurried way of his. We'll sit together on the rocks and the fog will come in around us slowly, and we'll have nowhere else to be, nowhere else we'd rather go. We continue. What I'm about to tell you happened about 8 months ago, and barely a day goes by that I don't think about some part of it. Not because I enjoy revisiting it, I don't, but because there are things in it I still can't explain, and in my experience, unexplained things don't stay put. They follow you around, they sit down next to you when you're trying to fall asleep, they wait. But I want to start from the beginning because without the context, the story loses the thing that makes it matter. My sister Claire and I hadn't spoken in almost 2 years. I want to be clear that this wasn't some sudden dramatic rupture. It was the kind of estrangement that builds the way mold builds inside a wall slowly, invisibly, until one day the whole surface buckles and you realize the damage was happening long before you noticed. The specific argument that ended things happened at our father's funeral, which was already about as bad a setting as you can imagine for an honest conversation. I told her she had always made everything about herself. She told me I had never once shown up when the family needed me. We were probably both right, at least partially, which is the worst kind of argument to have because there's no clear villain and no clean ending. What I can tell you is that I missed her. I missed her in the background of everything, the way you miss a sound that's been part of your environment for so long you only notice it when it's gone. Claire had been a constant in my life since I could remember. 3 years younger than me, small and stubborn and embarrassingly kind, the type of person who would stop in the middle of a busy sidewalk to help a confused tourist with a map, the type who kept a spare granola bar in her jacket pocket because she said you never knew. We had grown into different kinds of adults in different cities with different schedules, but we had always kept a line open between us. After our father died, that line went quiet. I thought about reaching out many times. I'd draft a message and then leave it sitting in the text window for an hour before deleting it. I'd have a second glass of wine at dinner and convince myself I'd call in the morning, and then morning would come and the old pride would be back solid as ever and I wouldn't call. That's how it went for nearly 2 years. I'm not proud of it. So when my phone buzzed at 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, pulling me out of a shallow and unremarkable sleep, the last number I expected to see lighting up my screen was hers. It wasn't a call. It was a text message. Just 3 things: a street address, a cross street, and 2 words. Please come. That was the entirety of it. No explanation, no context, no sign of whether she was in danger or drunk or just overwhelmed and reaching out at the worst possible hour. 2 words and an address in a part of the city I barely knew. I sat on the edge of my bed for what felt like a long time. I turned my phone over in my hands and read those 2 words again and tried to talk myself out of doing what I already knew I was going to do. I told myself it could be a mistake, a misdirected message meant for someone else. I reminded myself how long the silence had been and how painful the last conversation was. I told myself I didn't owe her anything at 3 in the morning with no explanation given. But there was something in those 2 words, please come, that bypassed all of that. You know how certain things can sound like someone, the specific way they'd phrase something, and that was how I felt reading it. That was exactly how Claire would ask for something she was embarrassed to need. Not, I'm in trouble, not call me, not anything direct, just that. I called the number. It rang 8 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording, bright, slightly too fast, exactly how she always talked, caught me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. I hung up without leaving a message and called again. Same thing. I put on my coat, picked up my keys and went to my car. The drive took about 25 minutes. At that hour, the city has a different character, emptied out and honest about itself in a way it isn't during the day. The part of town the address led me to was on the southeast side, near the old industrial waterfront, an area I had driven past but never really been into. The further I went, the more the surroundings changed. Warehouses with shuttered loading docks, chain-link fences topped with rust, a tire shop with a hand-painted sign barely legible under a single bare bulb, empty lots where something used to be and nothing had replaced it yet. The streetlights thinned out and the ones that remained were pale and intermittent, throwing just enough light to remind you how much darkness there was around them. I found the street easily enough, a short one-way called Ella's Court, barely wider than an alley, tucked between 2 larger roads like an afterthought. 12 or 14 houses on each side, most of them dark, most of them quiet, except for one. Number 14 had a light on behind the curtains on the ground floor. Warm and orange, the kind of light that in any other context would look welcoming, like a fire in a hearth. A single car sat in the cracked driveway. The house itself was not a ruin, not obviously, not the way some of the other buildings on that block were, but it had the look of a place being allowed to decline very gradually. The paint on the front door was peeling in long curling strips. The garden had gone past wild into something more intentional looking, the bushes and dead plants forming a kind of dense screen between the house and the street, as if whatever was inside had decided it no longer wanted to be seen. I sat in my car with the engine running for a minute or 2 looking at it. Something felt off about the street, but I couldn't have told you what specifically. It was only later that I would identify it as the absence of sound. A residential street, even at that hour, has a baseline distant traffic, the occasional dog, the hum of appliances through thin walls. Ella's Court had none of that. It was sealed, silent in a way that felt less like late-night quiet and more like something actively held. There was a smell too, though I barely registered it at first. Something sweet but subtly wrong, like overripe fruit or flowers past their peak. I noticed it when I stepped out of the car and thought nothing of it. A dumpster somewhere, I assumed. A compost bin. I walked up to the front door of number 14 and knocked. She answered almost immediately. I say almost, because there was just barely enough of a pause to suggest she had been standing somewhere other than directly behind the door, but not by much. She was a woman somewhere in her late 50s or early 60s, silver hair pulled back neatly, dark eyes that were attentive in a way that was hard to characterize, not warm, but focused, like she was reading something in your face while you were still deciding what to say. She was dressed as if she'd never been to bed. A dark blouse, neat trousers, low shoes, no robe, no dishevelment. She looked like someone who had been awake for reasons of her own. She said pleasantly, "Can I help you?" I told her I was looking for my sister, that I'd received a message sent from this address. She listened without interrupting, and then she said, with the same pleasant composure, that she lived alone, that she had no idea who I was talking about, that she was sorry I'd been brought here for nothing. I was about to apologize and step back when I saw the coat. It was hanging on one of the hooks in the hallway behind her, visible past her left shoulder. Dark green, slightly worn at the elbows, with a small embroidered patch on the left lapel, a yellow bird, simple and a little faded from washing. Claire had found that coat at a vintage market years ago. I had been standing next to her when she pulled it off the rack. I had told her it was hideous, and she had laughed the way she laughed at things she found genuinely funny with her whole face and bought it on the spot. I had seen her wear it 100 times. I felt the air go out of my chest. I don't know what showed on my face, but something must have, because the woman's eyes moved just slightly. A small recalibration, and her expression didn't change so much as reset. She asked if I was all right. She suggested I might have the wrong address. She began very naturally to ease the door closed. I told her I recognized the coat in her hallway. Silence. Then she smiled. It was technically a smile, the mouth moved correctly, but it didn't reach her eyes, and her eyes were already somewhere else, measuring something. She said it was her coat. "Hey." The voice came from behind me, low and urgent, quiet enough not to carry far, but sharp enough to cut through everything else. I turned. There was a man standing on the front step of the house directly across the street, number 11. He was in his mid-40s, solidly built, with a jacket thrown on over a t-shirt like he'd grabbed it in a hurry. He was looking at me with an expression I've thought about many times since, controlled fear. The face of someone who is frightened but has been frightened long enough to have made a plan about it. "You don't want to go in there," he said. He wasn't looking at the woman, only at me. He came down his front step and crossed the street toward us. His name was Marcus. He told me quickly and quietly that he had been watching the house for 3 weeks, that he had seen the light appear in the window one night when the house should have been empty, and then people beginning to arrive at odd hours, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, and that he had never once seen any of them leave again through the front door. That he had called the police twice, and both times they had looked around, found nothing actionable, and left. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who has not been sleeping because they can't stop watching. The woman said pleasantly that Marcus was troubled, that he had been harassing her since she moved in, that she was sorry I'd been bothered by him. She said all of this without raising her voice. Marcus looked at me and said, "If someone asked you to come here, they need help, but you shouldn't go inside." I looked at him. I looked at her. I thought about those 2 words on my phone screen, and I thought about Claire's quote on the hook in the dark hallway. I went inside. I have asked myself about that decision many times. Each time I arrive at the same place. I knew my sister was in that house. Not suspected, knew. And I couldn't leave her there. That's the whole of it. The woman closed the door behind me. The inside was ordinary in a way I now understand was carefully constructed to appear so. A sofa with cushions arranged too symmetrically. The orange lamp on a side table, a clock on the wall, an old one with a loud, insistent ticking with a regularity that seemed irrationally aggressive. A grey cat sitting on the arm of the sofa, completely still, watching me with a fixed attention that animals don't usually waste on strangers. I remember thinking the cat looked less like a pet and more like something assigned to a post. The smell was much stronger inside, that sweet, rotten sweetness. Not like anything decaying visibly, no garbage, no obvious source, but present and intimate, the way certain smells get into the lining of things and refuse to leave. The woman offered me tea. She gestured to an armchair and asked me to sit down so we could sort out the misunderstanding. She was playing host with a dedication that would have seemed excessive even in normal circumstances. I said I'd love some tea, thank you, and asked if I could use the bathroom first. She pointed down the hallway. I walked slowly, reading the space around me. The hallway was narrow, and the warm light from the living room didn't reach far into it. The walls had framed photographs, landscapes mostly, nothing personal, but one of them caught my eye. A family portrait, the kind that might have hung there for decades. A couple and two children, posed formally, faces slightly blurred in the way of old photographs. There was nothing obviously wrong with it except that the glass over it was cracked, and someone had put a thin strip of tape over the crack as if intending to fix it later and then never bothering. The bathroom was at the end of the hallway, but there was another door just before it on the left, closed, and through it, barely audible, I could hear breathing. Slow, shallow. The breathing of someone unconscious or very nearly so. I knocked softly, nothing. I tried the handle, locked. I knocked again, harder, nothing. I am not someone who breaks down doors. I want to be clear about that. But I took a step back and put my shoulder into it, and I did it 3 times, and the third time the frame cracked and the door opened inward, and I found her. She was on the floor, curled on her side, with a folded jacket tucked under her head. Her face was pale, and her lips were dry, and her breathing was slow and shallow, but it was steady. It was Claire. I crouched down and said her name. I touched her face. She stirred, her eyes moved behind the lids. And she made a sound that wasn't yet a word but was trying to be. I heard the woman's footsteps stop at the end of the hallway. I turned and looked at her. The composure was leaving her face the way color leaves something in water. Not all at once, but steadily, visibly. Her posture had changed. She was still standing upright, but differently, with a kind of forward weight shift that reminded me, for reasons I couldn't name, of something that was about to move fast. Her head was tilted at an angle that was slightly wrong, not grotesquely, not in any way that would look unambiguous in a photograph, but wrong in the way that your body knows before your mind catches up. She said, "You should have had the tea." The pleasant measurement in her voice was entirely gone. What was underneath it was flat and even and absolutely certain, the voice of something that does not experience hesitation. I stood up, got my arms under Claire's and started pulling. The woman did not rush. That is the detail I keep returning to because rushing would have been almost reassuring. Something frightened moves fast. Something urgent moves fast. She moved toward us with a slow and complete deliberateness, covering the hallway in a way that felt like it wasn't subject to the same limits as other movement. The cat dropped from the sofa arm and went to sit at her feet as she walked, like punctuation. I got Claire through the hallway. I got the front door open. Cold air came through, and Claire gasped with something like consciousness returning, her hands finding my forearm and gripping it. We got across the threshold, and I heard from somewhere behind us in the dark hallway a sound that I have tried many times to describe and given up on. The best I can offer is this. It was something using a voice the way you might use a tool you borrowed and don't quite know how to hold. And it said very quietly as the door swung open between us, "You'll want to bring her back." Marcus was already crossing the street at a run. He had been watching from his window. He got to us within seconds, took Claire's other arm over his shoulder, and the 3 of us moved to my car. He told me to drive and not stop. I didn't need to be told to. I want to tell you, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something standing in the doorway of number 14 that I could describe in specific and verifiable terms, but that's not what happened. When I finally looked back, seconds after pulling away, the front door was closed. The light behind the curtains was off. The street was dark and entirely still. Ella's Court looked like what it probably was supposed to look like, an empty, forgotten little block that no one had any particular reason to visit. I took Claire straight to the emergency room. She came fully awake in the car, confused and frightened and asking questions I couldn't answer yet. She had no memory of Ella's Court. The last thing she remembered clearly was being at a bar with a friend earlier in the evening, a couple of miles from the waterfront. Someone had bought her a drink. She thought it was fine. That was where the timeline ended for her. The hospital kept her overnight. Whatever she had been given cleared her system without lasting damage, which a doctor told us with the careful neutrality that medical people use when they're aware the situation around the medical facts is unusual. Claire was physically okay. That mattered. That was the thing that mattered most. I called the police that night and again the following morning. Officers went to Ella's Court. They found nothing. The woman was gone, if she had ever been there. The house at number 14 showed no sign of recent occupation. One officer told me not unkindly that the utilities for the property had been disconnected the previous winter, and that the owner of record was an estate the original resident had died years ago. Marcus filed a statement that matched mine exactly. It didn't seem to change anything. I drove past the house about 6 weeks later in daylight because I needed to see it as plainly as possible. The garden was dead and overgrown. The curtains were gone from the windows. The front door was padlocked. The inside, visible through one bare window, was empty floor and nothing else. But when I stood on the front step, the smell was there, faint but unmistakable, sweet and subtly wrong, clinging to the cold air around the threshold exactly as it had before. I did not get out of the car for long. Claire and I are talking again. Properly. This time not carefully, not performing the idea of a repaired relationship, but actually talking. We've covered ground in the past 8 months that we hadn't covered in years. I don't think either of us wanted to say out loud that it took something like this to get us back to each other, but it did, and I'd rather have it this way than not have it at all. I stayed in touch with Marcus for a while, and he seemed okay, grounded, matter of fact about the whole thing, in the way of someone who had already made his peace with not being believed. But about 2 months ago, he stopped responding to messages. I went to Ellis Court once to check. The lights at number 11 were off. A neighbor coming out of the house 2 doors down told me the man who'd lived across the street had moved away suddenly, hadn't left a forwarding address, hadn't said goodbye to anyone on the block. I think about Marcus a lot. I think about him mostly at night when the house is quiet and I'm somewhere between waking and sleep and the room is very still and I catch or think I catch something at the edge of the air. Just faintly. Just enough to make me uncertain. That sweetness, that wrongness present and then gone before I can be sure of it. Maybe it's nothing. I've told myself it's nothing many times and mostly I believe it. But mostly is not the same as entirely, and I think that's where I'll leave this. That's the story. I wanted to put it somewhere, in its entirety, while the details were still clear enough to be worth putting down. If any of it sounds implausible, I completely understand. There was a time not so long ago when I would have heard a story like this and thought the same thing. I'm not in that place anymore. Thanks for listening. We continue. My father had a saying he repeated so often when I was growing up that by the time I was 12, I could have recited it in my sleep. He'd say, "Adrian, a man who ignores a warning deserves whatever finds him." He said it about driving too fast, about mixing certain people, about borrowing money you had no realistic plan to repay. He applied it to basically everything. When I was young, I thought it was just one of those things fathers say to sound wise. Now, sitting here trying to organize the words to tell you what happened on Interstate 20 on a Tuesday night in late October 3 years ago, I find myself thinking that maybe my father was onto something. Good evening to everyone listening, whether this is your first time tuning in or you've been here from the beginning. My name is Adrian Calloway. I'm 35 years old. I'm originally from Houston, Texas, and for the last 6 years I have worked as a commercial bus driver for a regional coach company that runs routes across the southern United States. Before that, I spent 4 years driving delivery trucks, so between the two jobs, I have been a professional behind the wheel for the better part of a decade. I know these roads. I've covered a lot of them in the dark and bad weather, with a full load of passengers depending on me to get them where they're going in one piece. I say this not to brag, I promise you. Driving a bus for a living is not the kind of profession that attracts a lot of envy, but because I want you to understand right from the start that I am not someone who spooks easily. I'm a practical person. I believe in what I can see, and I believe in what I can explain. What I'm about to tell you I cannot fully explain. And I have spent 3 years trying. Let me back up to the beginning. The route I've driven most consistently over the past 6 years is the Dallas to Shreveport run, roughly 3 hours and change depending on traffic and stops. It's not a glamorous route by any measure, no scenic views, no interesting landmarks, just a long straight push east through the tail end of Texas and into Louisiana. During the day it's just highway driving, and at night it's highway driving in the dark, which sounds like the same thing but isn't, not really. At night the road feels smaller, more personal. The other lanes mostly empty out, the radio stations get harder to find, and it's just you and your headlights and whatever's out there in the dark ahead. Most of my passengers on that route are ordinary people, students heading home for a weekend, elderly folks who don't like flying, people traveling on a budget who need to get from one place to another without it costing them too much. On the late departures, the 9:45 p.m. out of Dallas, which is what I was working that night, the crowd tends to be quieter, more self-contained. People who prefer to travel when the world isn't watching, if that makes sense. I'm not criticizing. After 10 years driving, I've stopped judging the people who get on my bus. Everyone is going somewhere and everyone has a reason. That night was a Tuesday, October, late in the month, when the days have already started getting short and the evenings feel like they arrived too early. We had 17 passengers when we pulled out of the Dallas terminal at 9:47 p.m., 2 minutes past scheduled departure, which in this industry is close enough to count as perfect. I know the exact number because I count every single time before every single departure. It's not an official requirement anymore, not since we updated our digital ticketing, but I never stopped doing it. My first supervisor told me to always count heads, and I never found a good reason to quit. 17. I noted it, did my checks, and we rolled out into the night. The first hour was completely normal. Light traffic on I-20 heading east, weather clear enough, temperature cool but not cold. Most of my passengers settled in quickly. This is a late night run. People know what they're signing up for. By the time we crossed into Marshall, I could tell by the sounds behind me that at least half of them were asleep. The ones still awake were on their phones, the glow of the screens reflecting off the windows. There's a kind of comfortable rhythm to a quiet late-night bus, once everyone settles. The engine is steady, the road is smooth enough, and for stretches at a time it can feel almost peaceful. I should tell you about the weather because it matters. When we left Dallas, it was clear. By the time we got past Marshall and started getting closer to the Louisiana state line, rain had started coming in from the northwest. Not a dramatic storm, no lightning, no thunder, just that dense gray rain that falls straight down and doesn't make a sound until suddenly you realize you can barely see the road markings. I slowed down accordingly. The stretch of I-20 between Marshall and Greenwood, Louisiana, is not where you want to find out your reaction time is a half-second slower than you thought. The trees come in close on both sides, the shoulder narrows, and there are curves in there that feel tighter than they actually are, especially at night. I was focused, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, speed well under what I could legally do. I was not distracted, I was not tired, I had not been on the road long enough to feel the kind of fatigue that plays tricks on your eyes. I want to be clear about all of this because what I'm about to describe is the kind of thing that sounds like the brain filling in gaps, and I don't want you to be able to explain it that easily. At approximately 11:15 p.m., I heard a voice. It came from directly behind me from seat 14, which is the first row in the passenger section, right behind the partial partition that separates me from the cabin. The seat was empty. I knew it was empty because when we'd boarded in Dallas, a heavy-set man in a canvas jacket had tried to sit there, and I'd redirected him toward the middle of the bus, where the seats reclined properly. Seat 14's mechanism is broken, the seat locks upright, which makes a 3-hour trip uncomfortable. Nobody was sitting there, I was sure of it, but the voice said, clearly and without any particular urgency, "There's something in the road about 1.5 miles ahead, close to the 182-mile marker. You'll want to move left." It was a woman's voice. Older, I thought. The kind of voice that has some age to it, some weight. Not alarmed, not dramatic. She said it the way you'd tell someone there's a wet patch on the floor. Matter of fact, I'll tell you what I did not do. I did not panic. I've already explained that I'm a practical person, and my first practical thought was that someone had gotten on in Dallas that I'd miscounted, or that a sleeping passenger had moved up front and I hadn't noticed. My second thought was that I'd imagined it that the rain and the monotony had conspired to put a sound in my head that wasn't there. Both of those are reasonable explanations. I told myself I'd look properly when I had a safe moment. In the meantime, almost without really deciding to, I moved to the left lane. About 90 seconds later, my headlights swept over a deer lying dead in the right lane. A large one, a buck probably, though I didn't slow down to get a better look. It was positioned squarely enough in the lane that hitting it at highway speed would have, at minimum, blown a front tire. In the rain on that road, a blowout could mean a lot of things and none of them good. I passed it cleanly in the left lane. I exhaled, I gripped the wheel. I didn't say anything out loud for a moment, and then I said quietly, into the partition, "Thank you." No response. I checked my mirror. The interior of the bus was dim, passengers asleep or staring at their phones. Seat 14, from what I could see, was empty. No one there, no outline, no shape, nothing. I kept driving. Here's the honest truth. If it had stopped there, I probably would have found a way to put it behind me. One incident, one possible explanation, nothing I couldn't file under weird night and let go. But it didn't stop there. About 45 minutes later, somewhere between the Texas state line and Greenwood, the voice came again. Same location behind me, same calm, unhurried tone. There's a curve coming up in about 3 miles. The guardrail on the outside edge is damaged. There's a gap in it. The road gets slick right there. Give yourself a lot more room than you think you need. I want to tell you that I argued with myself more that second time, that I almost didn't listen, that I thought hard about the rational explanation. And I did think about all of that, but I also slowed down. I slowed down to a speed that, looking back on it, was probably more appropriate for a parking lot than a highway. And I took that curve with every bit of caution I had. And there was the gap, right where she said, a section of guardrail, maybe 12 feet of it, missing entirely from the outer edge of the curve. Beyond it was a drainage ditch that had filled up with rainwater, deep enough and steep-sided enough that if a loaded bus had gone through that gap at speed in the rain, well, I don't like thinking about what the rest of that night would have looked like. I drove the rest of that trip with my hands very still on the wheel and my eyes moving between the road and my mirror more than they should have, and the voice came twice more before we reached Shreveport. Once to warn me about a stretch of active construction where a lane closure sign had fallen over in the rain and was lying flat on the shoulder, invisible until you were almost on top of it, true. And once to say in a slightly different tone than the others, quieter and almost conversational, you have a son, about 8 years old. My son Marcus is 8. I have never mentioned him on this podcast before this moment, and I certainly hadn't mentioned him on that bus to anyone. The way she said it, not as a threat, not as a warning, just as a small piece of knowledge she happened to have, was the most unsettling thing that happened all night. More unsettling somehow than the gap in the guardrail. I started to ask how she knew that. I said 2 words. How do you... And then we were pulling into the Shreveport terminal, and the world snapped back to normal, in the way it does when a bus full of people starts moving and gathering their bags and shuffling toward the exit. I did what I always do. Opened the doors, said goodbye to the passengers who acknowledged me, watched them file off into the terminal. I counted them as they left, 17. When the last one was gone, I walked to the back of the empty bus and came forward again, checking every seat, every overhead compartment, every floor space, every possible location where a person could have been sitting or hiding. Seat 14 was empty. It looked exactly the way it always looks when nobody has sat there. I sat in the driver's seat for a while after that. I'm not sure how long. Eventually I started the engine and moved the bus to the overnight lot and went through my end-of-shift routine, which I did on autopilot, and then I got in my car and drove home, and I sat in my driveway for a while before I went inside. The next morning I reported all 3 road hazards to operations: the deer, the guardrail, the construction signage. The highway crew confirmed all 3 independently before noon. I said I'd spotted them during the run. Nobody asked follow-up questions. That part of the story is easy to verify. I checked with the maintenance dispatch records myself later. I didn't tell anyone else anything for several weeks. Then I asked to pull the security footage from that night's run. My company's buses have interior cameras, a single wide-angle unit, mounted above the driver's partition, covering the whole passenger section. I told dispatch I was reviewing it in response to a noise complaint one of the passengers had filed, which wasn't exactly a lie. I was reviewing it because of something unusual that had happened in the passenger section. They gave me access without any fuss. I sat in the back office of the terminal and watched 53 minutes of footage with the sound turned up as high as it would go. Seat 14 was empty for the entire recording. I watched myself glance into the partition gap and respond to nothing. I watched myself ease left on the highway and later slow before the curve. And both times from the camera's perspective, I looked like a driver making a solo judgment call on a dark, wet road. There was nothing there. No one sitting behind me. No shadow, no shape, no reflection. Except, at approximately the 38-minute mark, a woman seated about 5 rows back, middle-aged, grey coat, had been asleep for most of the recording, woke up suddenly. She looked toward the front of the bus. Then she reached over and shook the shoulder of the man sitting next to her, who lifted his head and looked in the same direction towards seat 14. He stared for a moment, then settled back down. The woman in the grey coat stayed awake and watchful for the next 12 minutes before the footage ended. She had seen something, or heard something. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at seat 14. I thought about trying to find her for weeks. Thought about putting in a records request for the passenger manifest and reaching out. And then I decided I wouldn't, because I'm not sure what I would have said to her, and I'm even less sure I wanted to hear what she might say back. The last piece of this story, I'll admit, sounds almost too convenient, but I'm not here to make anything up, so I'll tell it the way it happened. About a month after the bus ride, I was in a used bookstore near my neighborhood. I go there on days off, mostly to walk around and kill time, and near the back there was a table covered with loose papers and laminated clippings, the kind of miscellaneous archive material that gets donated in boxes and ends up everywhere. I was flipping through without any real intention, and I came across a laminated newspaper article, the Shreveport Times, 1987. The headline read, "7 dead after coach plunges off I-20 near Greenwood, Louisiana." I read the whole article standing at that table. A Dallas to Shreveport overnight run operated by a company that doesn't exist anymore, late October, rain. A damaged section of guardrail on a curve near Greenwood that had been reported but not yet repaired. The driver the article gave his name as Carl Dobbs, 51 years old, failed to negotiate the curve safely. 7 passengers died, 4 more were hospitalized. The driver was among the dead. There was a smaller sidebar attached to the main piece with a paperclip that had long since rusted. A survivor had given a statement to investigators. She said that a woman seated at the front of the bus behind the driver had been saying something to him for several miles before the accident, trying to get his attention, warning him. The driver had not responded. The survivor did not know who the woman was. Her name appeared on no manifest, matched no ticket record, and was never identified. In the chaos that followed the crash, nobody could say with certainty whether she had survived or not. Attached to that statement was a police sketch. Rough, the way all police sketches are, not enough detail to be certain about anything. But the general shape of the face, the way the hair was drawn, the age of her as depicted on that page. I stood there long enough that the bookstore owner eventually came over to ask if I was all right. I put the article back in the pile, walked to the front, and bought a cup of coffee from the small machine near the register. I drank it outside, standing in the parking lot, looking at nothing in particular. I still drive the Dallas to Shreveport route, not every week, but regularly enough. I still count my passengers before departure every time, without fail. I still do my safety checks. I still pay attention to the road in every way I know how, because 10 years of doing this job have taught me that the road will always find a way to test you, and the best thing you can do is be ready. And every time I pass my marker 182, and every time I take that curve near Greenwood, I check my mirror. Seat 14 is always empty. But I check anyway. My father used to say that a man who ignores a warning deserves whatever finds him. I don't ignore warnings anymore. Good night, everyone. Drive safe out there. We continue. Good evening to everyone watching this channel. Thank you for being here. My name is Daniel Carr. I'm 44 years old, and for the past 18 years I've worked as a long-haul freight driver, mostly overnight routes, interstate to interstate, the kind of runs that start when normal people are sitting down to dinner and end when the first shift of the world is just starting to wake up. Before I say anything else, I want to establish something about myself because it matters to the story. I am not a person who frightens easily. I've spent nearly 2 decades alone on dark highways. I've changed blown tires on the shoulder in the middle of thunderstorms, with semis blowing past me at 80 miles an hour. I've driven through ice storms in mountain passes, I've had deer come through the windshield, and I've passed more rollover accidents than I can count. None of it, not one single thing in 18 years, ever kept me up at night. What happened on a Tuesday evening in late October about 3 years ago is a different story entirely. I was running a route through the southeastern part of the country, one of those long, flat stretches of interstate where the land goes on forever, and the only things that break the monotony are overpass signs and the occasional rest stop. It was a 9-hour run, and I was about 4 hours in. I remember the exact date because I had just called my daughter before starting the route. It was her birthday. She had just turned 12, and I was carrying that particular heaviness that comes from being 500 miles away from someone you love on a day that matters. The rain started around midnight, not dramatic, just steady and cold, and the kind of rain that makes the road look like black glass. I had the radio low and I was focused on the lines, the way you get after enough hours, just you and the road and the hum. That's when I saw the figure on the shoulder. I need to be absolutely clear about something. I have a personal rule against picking up hitchhikers. 18 years of driving teaches you very quickly that the road attracts a specific kind of trouble, and inviting a stranger into a cab in the middle of the night is one of the fastest ways to find it. I have never broken that rule, not once. But this was different. It was a woman standing completely still in the rain, not waving, not walking, just standing there with her arms at her sides like she hadn't even registered the downpour. My headlights hit her as I came up and I could see she was young, maybe mid-20s, in a light jacket that was soaked useless at doing absolutely nothing to protect her. There was something about her stillness that got to me in a way I can't fully explain. Most people on the shoulder of an interstate are moving, pacing, gesturing, doing something. She looked like she had simply stopped, and I told myself I would just roll down the window and ask if she was okay, that was all. Maybe call someone for her. I pulled over. She walked to the window when I opened it, slowly, and she looked up at me with the most exhausted pair of eyes I've ever seen on a living person. She asked very quietly, almost too quiet to hear over the rain, if I could take her to the next town. She said she just needed to get to the next town. I said yes. I opened the door and she climbed up into the cab, and that was when I noticed she was only wearing one shoe. Her right foot was in a plain white sneaker. Her left foot was bare, just wet skin on the rubber floor mat. I almost said something about it immediately, but she looked so wrung out, so completely exhausted, that I didn't want to add embarrassment on top of whatever else she was dealing with. I handed her a bottle of water from the cup holder. She said thank you, and I pulled back onto the interstate. We drove for about 15 minutes in silence. She didn't offer her name, and I didn't ask. Not everybody wants to talk at 2 a.m. in the rain, and I've learned to read when quiet is what someone needs. I was watching the road, doing the mental math on my delivery time, and then I reached over to offer her a granola bar I had sitting on the dash. The seat was empty. I want to take a moment here because I know how that sounds, and I know the first reaction is to look for the rational explanation. She climbed back. She opened the door. She fell asleep somewhere. The truck was moving at highway speed. The passenger door had not opened. I would have heard it, felt pressure change, seen it in my peripheral vision. The sleeping berth door behind the seats was closed and latched from my side. The window was up. There was nowhere for a person to go. I pulled over. I checked every inch of that cab under the dash. In the berth, I got out and looked underneath the truck. I walked the shoulder in both directions with my phone light. I called out into the rain. Nothing. Not a footprint in the wet grass, and not a sound, not a shadow. When I climbed back into the cab, there was something on the passenger seat that had not been there before. A child's shoe, small and pink, with a Velcro strap. Not the woman's shoe she had been wearing, an adult sneaker. This was a toddler's size, maybe a 7, the kind of shoe a 2-year-old wears. I didn't sleep that night. I made my delivery at 6 a.m. and drove home, and when I got there, I did the only thing I could think of that had any logical path forward. I searched missing persons cases in the county where I had stopped. I found a news article from 6 years earlier. A young woman named Claire Matheson, 23 years old, had disappeared from a small town about 40 miles from the spot where I pulled over. She had last been seen on the highway heading east. She was found 8 months after her disappearance in a wooded area near a rest stop. She had been murdered. She had a daughter, a little girl, barely 2 years old at the time, who was never found. The case was still listed as open. The article had a photograph. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I don't know what I picked up that night. I don't know what sat in my truck for 15 minutes in the rain and then disappeared. But I kept that pink shoe. I kept it in the glove compartment for almost 2 years, and then I called the detective listed on the missing persons case and described everything that had happened. I know how I sounded. The detective was polite and careful in the way that people are when they think they're talking to a crackpot. But she took down everything I said. 3 weeks later, she called me back. I won't go into the details of what she told me because the case is still being worked and she asked me to keep it quiet. But she told me that the shoe was consistent with footwear the little girl had been documented wearing and that she wanted me to come in. The girl would be 8 years old now. I think about her every time I drive that stretch of highway, which is still regularly, because the freight doesn't stop moving because you had a strange night. And every time I check the shoulder, I don't know what I'm hoping to see. I don't know what I'm hoping won't see me first. We continue. Good evening to everyone here. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 51 years old and I have been driving long haul for 23 years. I have active routes through 14 states, and I've put more miles on American highways than most people accumulate in a lifetime of ordinary driving. I know this country's road system the way some people know their own block, the grades, the curves, the weather patterns of specific mountain passes. which interstate way stations are open on Sundays. I am telling you this because it's important that what I'm going to describe is not something that happened to someone who got lost easily or didn't know where he was. I knew exactly where I was right up until I didn't. I was running a freight route 2 summers ago through the Central Plains flat country, wheat fields on both sides, roads so straight and level that the challenge isn't navigation, it's staying awake. I was making good time and feeling fine when my GPS recalculated around midnight. No reason I could identify, no road closure alerts, no traffic, nothing. The new route it offered added about 4 miles and sent me down a 2-lane county road off the interstate. I've had GPS do stranger things. 4 miles is nothing on a long haul, so I took the turn. The county road was unmarked and unfamiliar, which wasn't alarming. There are tens of thousands of miles of county roads out there that I've never driven. I followed it for about 8 miles through flat farmland with no lights anywhere, and then the road went over a small rise. And on the other side of that rise, there was a town. I want to be precise about this. I have driven through that region no fewer than 30 times over the years. There is no town on any road within 20 miles of where I was driving. I know this not only from memory, but because I checked afterward extensively with satellite maps and county records and historical atlases. There is nothing there, just fields and the occasional isolated farmhouse. But there it was, streetlights on wooden poles, storefronts with hand-lettered signs, a water tower with a name printed on it. In block letters I couldn't read it clearly from the road. Houses set back from the street with warm light in the windows. Everything neat and quiet, the kind of small American town that used to exist everywhere and mostly doesn't anymore. What struck me first before anything else was how still it was. Not quiet the way a town is quiet at midnight, quiet the way a photograph is quiet. I drove slowly down the main street and the lights were on and there were cars parked at the curb and I could see figures in some of the windows but nothing moved. Not a curtain, not a branch, not a cat crossing the street. The man sitting on the bench near the water tower was completely motionless, like a mannequin put there to suggest a living person rather than be one. My gas was low enough that the gauge was nudging the warning light, and there was a filling station at the near end of the main street. The pumps were old, but they worked. I got out and started fueling, and the whole time I kept looking around, waiting for something to shift, for the stillness to break. It didn't. Nothing in that town moved except me. I was finishing up and getting ready to leave when a woman came out of the diner across the street. She was the only moving thing in the entire town, and she moved with purpose, not walking, almost hurrying, the way you move when you're trying to reach someone before they leave. She crossed the street and came directly to my truck, and up close she looked entirely real in a way that nothing else in that town quite managed. She was maybe 40, plainly dressed, with the kind of face that belongs to someone who works hard and sleeps poorly. She put her hand on the frame of the open window, and she looked at me with an expression I've been trying to categorize for 2 years. Not fear exactly, more like urgency mixed with pity. She said, "You need to leave and not come back here at night. Tell whoever dispatches you that this road is closed. Do you understand me? This road is closed." I asked her what she meant. I asked who she thought was dispatching me. She held my gaze for a moment, deciding something, and then she said, "You shouldn't be able to see this place at all. Something about you is making it visible, and if that something brings you back here after dark, they will keep you here the way they keep everything else." She stepped back from the truck. I asked her who they were, and she just shook her head slowly and walked back towards the diner. I left. I drove back to the interstate at a speed that was not safe, and I did not stop until I hit a truck stop with lights and people and the ordinary noise of the world. In the morning I pulled up every map I could find of that area. Nothing. 2 days later I drove back in broad daylight to find the turn, and the county road existed. But it ended in a field about a half-mile in, blocked by a rusted chain with a no trespassing sign that looked like it had been there for 30 years. No tire tracks in the dirt but mine. No rise in the road, no water tower on the horizon, nothing. My GPS has never recalculated me onto that road again. I check every time I run that route. Every time the GPS takes me straight down the interstate and never suggests anything else. The woman told me something was wrong with me. I went to my doctor the following week and had a complete physical. Everything came back normal, but she said it like a diagnosis, not a warning, like she was reading something off a chart. I hope she was wrong. But I keep thinking about what she said was keeping everything else and what everything else might mean in a town that doesn't appear on any map and goes completely still the moment you're not looking directly at it. We continue. Good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas Aldridge. I'm 38 years old and I've been a freight driver for 11 years, which is a shorter run than some people you'll hear from on this channel. But 11 years on overnight mountain routes has a way of aging a person's understanding of what the road is and what it can do. And I want to say before anything else that I started this job as a committed skeptic and I am no longer anything of the kind. This happened about 3 years ago on a corridor I still drive 4 or 5 times a year through the mountain west high elevation, long tunnels bored through granite, the kind of road where you lose cell coverage for 50 miles at a stretch and the CB radio is your only link to anything outside the cab. I've always kept the CB on out of habit. It's mostly other drivers, mostly mundane, but out in those mountains it's also just a reminder that other people exist somewhere beyond the dark and the rock. I was about 2 hours into the mountain section, no signal on my phone, radio stations dropping in and out, just the beam of my headlights on the road ahead when the CB turned on by itself. I want to be precise. I had turned it off. The switch was in the off position. It turned on anyway, a small red light on the unit, and what came through wasn't another driver or a dispatcher. It was music, old big band music, the kind your grandparents danced to, clear and full with no static, no interference, no degradation, just clean, bright music in the cab of my truck at 11 at night in the middle of the mountains. I reached over and switched the CB off. The music kept playing. I turned the volume knob all the way to the left. The music got quieter but didn't stop, as if it was coming from somewhere in the air of the cab rather than the speaker itself. I sat with that for a moment and then the music stopped on its own, mid-phrase, like someone had lifted the needle. Then 2 people started talking, a driver and a dispatcher, or that's what it sounded like, the back and forth rhythm of a check-in call. The dispatcher was asking for a location and the driver was providing one, calm and professional. I listened because there was nothing else I could do and because something about the voices already felt slightly wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. They sounded clear but distant, like a recording of a recording. The driver said, "I've got something on the road ahead. It's large. I can't make out what it is. It's not moving." The dispatcher asked if he could go around it. Silence, longer than it should have been. Then the driver said, "No, it's taking up the full lane. I'm going to have to slow down and get closer." I kept my eyes on the road and my hands on the wheel, but I will tell you honestly that something cold had started working its way up the back of my neck because of the driver's voice. In the space of those 2 transmissions, something had changed in it. He had started the call sounding completely professional, routine, and he now sounded the way a person sounds when they are working very hard to keep fear out of their voice and not entirely succeeding. "It's looking at me," he said. A pause. The dispatcher called his unit number once, twice. "I'm going to try to go around it on the right shoulder," the driver said. Then the sound of tires on a gravel shoulder. Then something I cannot adequately describe, not a crash, not any animal sound I have ever heard, is something else that I will not attempt to recreate for you because I don't think I could do it justice and I don't think I want to. And then nothing. The dispatcher called the unit number 6 more times, getting progressively more urgent, and received nothing back. Then the CB turned off. I drove the rest of that mountain passage another 40 minutes without touching the radio. I didn't want to hear anything else. I didn't want to know if there was anything else to hear. When I got home 2 days later, I spent an afternoon searching accident records in that mountain corridor. I found a report from 14 years prior. A driver running the same route had gone off the road on a straight stretch of highway with no other vehicles involved and no weather conditions listed as a factor. The truck had left the road and gone down a 40-foot embankment. The driver had been found alive in the wreckage but had died at the hospital before he could speak. The investigating report noted that the last transmission logged by his dispatcher had been, "I've got something on the road." The official determination was falling asleep at the wheel. I've thought about that determination a lot. I've thought about what the dispatcher logged and what the official report chose to do with it. And I've thought about the fact that the mountain pass where that accident happened is the same mountain pass I was driving through when the CB turned on by itself and played music from a dead era and let me listen to a man die in real time or in memory or in whatever other category that experience belongs to that I don't have a word for. I still drive that corridor several times a year, every single time, At roughly the same elevation and the same section of road, the CB turns on by itself. Always the same thing, a low hiss of static, lasting about 30 seconds and then off again. I've documented it. I have the dates written in a notebook I keep in the truck. One time, just once, I turned the CB on myself in that section, thinking that if I was going to hear it anyway, I might as well meet it halfway. The static started immediately. It built for about 10 seconds, the same as always. And then from somewhere very deep in the hiss, something that had the shape of a voice began to form. I turned it off before it could finish. I made myself a rule that night: the CB stays off in those mountains. I don't care about being isolated, I don't care about losing contact. Whatever is on the other end of that frequency has already said its piece to one driver on that road, and I have a feeling there is no version of the conversation that ends well for the person listening. The notebook is still in the glove box. I've kept logging the dates. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe because there's a part of me that believes documentation is its own kind of protection, that as long as someone is writing down what happens, it has to remain in the world of things that can be known and examined rather than the other world, the one that turns your CB on in the dark. So far I've been right about that. So far. We continue. I don't quite know how to start this. I've tried a dozen times over the past few years, and every version I write ends up feeling either too dramatic or not dramatic enough. Neither one does justice to what actually happened. So I'll just start where it started, which is the summer my little sister Maddie disappeared from the swimming hole behind my grandfather's property in eastern Kentucky. I was 16, Maddie was 7. She was the kind of kid who never sat still, never stopped talking, never met a stranger in her life. She had these bright red rubber rain boots she wore everywhere, rain or shine, summer or winter. And my mother fought with her about them every single morning, and Maddie won every time. That's who she was, small and stubborn and full of a kind of brightness that was impossible to look away from. My grandfather's land was deep in Harlan County, back in a narrow valley where the hills came in close on both sides. Behind the main house, maybe a quarter mile through a stand of old hickory trees, there was a swimming hole, a wide, smooth bowl in the creek, where the water ran clear even in August. Generations of kids from 3 counties had grown up at that swimming hole, and hanging from the biggest hickory right at the edge of the bank was a rope swing, thick braided rope, weathered gray, with a fat knot at the bottom for your feet. You'd climb up onto the roots, grab the rope above the knot and push off, and the world would tilt and open up as you arced out over the water. When you let go, you dropped into the deepest part of the hole, maybe 12, 15 feet, cool and clean. There's nothing in the world like that feeling when you're a kid. That July Saturday, the kind of heat that sits right on top of you. My grandfather turned 70 and the whole family came up. Aunts, uncles, cousins I barely recognized. There must have been 30 people spread out across that porch and yard. Maddie had latched onto a group of cousins and spent the afternoon running through the grass. There was Jake, who was 9, his sister Nora, who was 10, and little Benny, who was 5 and followed Maddie everywhere because she was the only one patient enough to play with him. Around 4 o'clock, some of the older kids wanted to go down to the swimming hole. My Aunt Carol asked me to go along and keep an eye on the little ones, which I agreed to, though honestly, I wasn't paying much attention. I was 16 and I had other things on my mind. I sat on a flat rock in the shade and messed around with my phone while the kids took turns on the rope swing. Maddie had been asking to go on the swing since we got there. She'd been watching the older kids with this look of pure determination on her face. Jake helped boost her up to the root she needed to stand on, then steadied her while she grabbed the rope. She wrapped her legs around the knot and looked back over her shoulder at him with those big brown eyes. He gave her a push. I watched her swing out. I heard her laughing, this clear, high sound that carried over the noise of the water and the other kids. She swung all the way out to the full length of the rope, right over the deepest part of the hole, and then she was gone. Not a splash, not a cry, just gone. The rope swung back empty. I've spent 20 years trying to make sense of that moment. I've told myself she let go at the wrong angle, that she went straight down and the current took her under before anyone could react. I've constructed every rational explanation available to me. But the truth, the thing that none of us could say out loud for a very long time, was that every child on that bank saw the same thing I saw. One moment she was there, the next moment she wasn't. The rope came back empty and swaying. We searched for 4 hours. The sheriff brought divers. They worked the creek for 3 days in both directions. They brought in a team from the state. They found nothing. Not Maddie, Not those red rubber boots, not a single piece of clothing or hair or anything that said she had ever touched that water. She was simply gone, the way water goes when you pour it into sand completely, without a trace, without an explanation. There's nothing I can write that would do justice to what that does to a family. My mother didn't sleep for weeks. My father, who had always been a quiet man and became quieter and then smaller and then essentially absent, even when he was sitting right in front of you. He started drinking carefully and methodically, the way men do when they've already decided where they're going and they just need the means to get there. He was dead of liver failure before he turned 60. My grandfather never went back to the swimming hole. He had the rope cut down the week after Maddie disappeared, and he refused to discuss it for the rest of his life. The hickory tree the swing had hung from was struck by lightning the following summer and split straight down the middle. I always thought that was a kind of justice, though I couldn't have told you exactly what kind. My cousin Jake was the one who'd put Maddie on the rope. He was 9 years old when it happened, and he carried that for the rest of his childhood and into his adult life. By his late teens, he was in and out of trouble. Nothing serious, mostly drinking and bad decisions, and he told me once, years later, sitting in his truck outside a gas station in Pineville, that he kept seeing her. Not in dreams, he said. He was careful to make that distinction, in the corner of the room, at the edge of the parking lot. A small shape in red boots, standing still, watching him. He said it started when he was 12, and he'd never told a single person before that night. I didn't know what to say to him then. I wasn't ready to tell him what I knew yet, which was that he wasn't alone in what he was seeing. I put all of it down as best I could. I got through high school on fumes and stubbornness, started 2 different programs at the community college, and ran out of money both times. When I was 22, I started driving trucks, and I kept driving them because the road had a way of keeping my mind from going back to that summer. There's something about long-haul driving the white lines in the headlights, the radio fading in and out between stations in the hills, that makes the past feel manageable. Like you're always moving away from it. I drove for almost 10 years without incident, and I was good at my job. My dispatchers trusted me with difficult routes and tight schedules, and I never let them down. I had a small apartment in Corbin, a truck I knew like my own body, and a quiet life that asked very little of me in return. Then, in October of 2019, and I was running a load through eastern Kentucky on a county road I'd never used before. The main highway had a bridge under repair, and I'd been rerouted through the hills. It was late afternoon, overcast, that particular gray light of a Kentucky October that makes the trees look like they're printed on paper. I came around a long bend in the road, and there it was, hanging from the crossbar of a wooden utility pole on the shoulder of the road, a thick braided rope, gray with age, with a heavy knot at the bottom, swaying slowly in air that wasn't moving. I slowed down without thinking. My hands went to the wheel and I pulled onto the gravel shoulder and sat there with the engine idling, looking at it through the windshield. My heart wasn't racing. That's the part I remember most clearly, the strange calm that came over me, like something settling into place, as though some part of me had been expecting this for a long time. I got out of the truck. I walked over and stood in front of it on that empty road, and I looked at it for a long time. No tree, no natural anchor point. The rope appeared to be attached directly to the top of the utility pole, which made no physical sense. No one had climbed that pole. There were no footprints in the gravel, no sign of anyone having been there at all. The rope was simply there, exactly as it had been on the bank of the swimming hole 20 years earlier. Same braid, same diameter, same knot at the bottom worn smooth from where children's feet had gripped it. I stood there long enough for a truck to pass on the other side of the road. The driver did slow down. Either he didn't see it, or he saw it and made the same choice I was about to make, which was to get back in the cab and drive and not stop until I was somewhere with lights and other people. That's what I did. I didn't tell anyone, not for weeks. I turned it over in my mind the way you worry a stone, looking for the angle that made it ordinary. Fatigue, stress, the tricks that lonely highways play on the mind after dark. I'd been driving 9 hours. I told myself these things the way you tell a child there's nothing under the bed, with that same flat certainty that doesn't quite convince anyone. 6 weeks later, I was parked at a rest stop outside Middlesbrough at 2 in the morning, eating a sandwich in the cab with the heater going. The lot was half full of other rigs. I looked out my side window at the strip of woods beyond the chain-link fence, and in the space between 2 trees, I saw the rope again. It was hanging there in the dark, the knot turning slowly. The way a swing turns when someone has just stepped off of it. The way it turned the evening we found it empty. I put down my sandwich. I sat without moving for a long time. Then I started the truck and left. After Middlesbrough, it happened more often, with less space between. I would catch it in my mirrors after crossing a bridge, hanging between two fence posts in a field that had been empty when I passed it. I saw it in the reflection of a diner window, superimposed over the parking lot. I heard something too, not every time, but often enough that I stopped being able to dismiss it. When I drove over water at night, there was a sound just under the engine noise. The sound of a child humming. No melody I could name. Just a thin, tuneless sound that seemed to come from directly below the truck, from the water beneath the bridge, rising up through the frame and into the cab. I called my mother in December. I hadn't discussed Maddie with her, really discussed her in years. We had an unspoken agreement in what remained of our family not to pick at it directly. You could circle around it, reference it in passing, but you didn't name it straight on. So when I called, I started carefully. I told her I'd been seeing things on the road that were bothering me, that I was having trouble sleeping. She asked me, in the same careful voice I'd been using, whether what I was seeing had anything to do with a rope. The hair went up on the back of my neck. She told me she'd been seeing it in the backyard. Always at night, always from her bedroom window, hanging from the oak tree she'd planted the year Maddie was born. She said the first time she saw it, she was sure she was sleepwalking. The second time, she went outside to look and it was gone before she reached the yard. The third time, she told me she didn't go outside. She sat in her window and watched it sway for 20 minutes, and she said what she felt, and this is exactly how she described it, was not fear, but something colder than fear. Recognition. I drove to Pineville the following weekend. My mother made coffee and we sat at her kitchen table and talked about it properly for the first time. She told me she'd spoken with my Aunt Frances, her older sister, who lived over in Bell County. Frances had seen it too, and Frances's youngest daughter, who had been a toddler the summer Maddie died, who had no conscious memory of any of it, had called her mother twice in the past month to ask about a rope hanging from the tree in her front yard. Both times Frances had gone out and found nothing. My mother was not a superstitious woman. I need you to understand that. She was practical and private, and she had her faith. But it wasn't the kind of faith that included hauntings or curses or unexplained presences in the night. She was not the kind of woman who said the words she said to me that afternoon lightly. She said she thought something was following us, that it had been following the family for a long time, maybe since the beginning. And she said she had already spoken to someone about it. There was a woman in Pineville named Mrs. Eunice Combs, who was 82 years old and had been a quiet presence in that part of the county for as long as anyone could remember. Not a dramatic figure, not someone who advertised herself. She was just a woman who had grown up with older knowledge, the kind that gets passed down in those hills from mother to daughter across generations, knowledge of plants and old prayers and practices that people went to her for when the regular kind of help had run out. My grandmother had known her. Half the families in that valley had a story about something she'd helped with. My mother had gone to see her 3 weeks before I drove down. Mrs. Combs had listened to the whole account without interrupting, and then she had asked my mother 2 questions: whether anyone in the family had heard music near water recently, and whether Maddie had been born in July. Both answers were yes. I'd been hearing the humming under bridges for 2 months by then. Maddie had been born the 14th of July. Mrs. Combs told my mother she believed something had attached itself to our family through the water, through the grief we had been carrying, unaddressed for 20 years. She said grief left alone in the dark has a weight to it that certain things are drawn to. Not Maddie herself, she was clear about that. Maddie was at rest, but something that had found the shape of her absence and worn it, the way water takes the shape of whatever holds it. She said she could help, but that what she needed to do required something from her, and we should know that going in. I wasn't there the day my mother and Aunt Frances went back to see her. My mother asked me not to be, and I didn't push. They drove over on a Thursday morning in January, and were there for nearly 4 hours. When my mother called me that evening, I could hear it in her voice, an exhaustion that went down deeper than tiredness, the sound of someone who had set something down that was very heavy. She said Mrs. Combs had confirmed what she'd suspected. She said the old woman had done what she could, and that it had cost her. She said to tell Jake, if I saw him. that the thing he'd been seeing wasn't real, or rather that it wasn't Maddie, and that it couldn't follow him anymore. Mrs. Combs died in her sleep 17 days later. Her neighbors said she'd been in good health right up until the end. She was 82 years old, and there was nothing unusual about a woman of that age dying quietly in the night. I don't know what she gave up in that room with my mother and my aunt. I've thought about it more times than I can tell you. I don't have an answer, and I've made peace with not having one. What I do know is that after January of 2020, I stopped seeing the rope. I drove through all of that year, through every season, over hundreds of bridges, up past every creek and river and lake in a 5-state area, and I never saw it again. The humming stopped. My mother started sleeping through the night for the first time since the summer of 1999. Aunt Francis's daughter stopped sleepwalking. Jake called me in the spring and said, without context, without explaining what he meant, that whatever had been in his room for 20 years wasn't there anymore. He sounded like a man who'd put down a long illness. He sounded lighter. My mother passed 2 years later, in the spring of 2022. Congestive heart failure, the doctor said it, and I believe him. She was a woman who had been carrying too much for too long, and there are things the body records and accumulates that show up in the end whether you address them or not. She was 63 years old. I was holding her hand. Before she died, she told me she wanted the story told. Not because she expected everyone to believe it, but because she believed the silence around it had been part of the problem, that all those years of not talking about what we'd seen, not acknowledging it, had been a kind of invitation. She said grief needs to be spoken out loud or it becomes something else. She said that was what Mrs. Combs had told her, and she believed it. I've thought a lot about what happened to our family, and I've read what I could find on the subject, not ghost stories and horror forums, but accounts by people who study grief and trauma, how it moves through families across generations, how the thing that breaks one person can echo forward into children who were never even there. I don't know exactly what the rope swing was. I don't know if it was something drawn to our grief or something made of it, some weight we'd left unattended for so long it had taken on a shape and a will of its own. I don't know what Mrs. Combs did or what she paid. What I know is that Maddie was 7 years old and she was full of light, and she wore red rubber boots in August, and we never found her. And our family spent 20 years leaving that door open without meaning to, and something came through it. I still drive. I cross water in the dark, and I keep my eyes on the road, and the radio plays clean all the way through the night. When I pull off at a rest stop and look out at the tree line, there's nothing there but trees. The rope is gone. Whatever wore Maddie's shape is gone. And every now and then, when I'm crossing a big river just before dawn, that grey hour when the water below looks like hammered steel and the sky is barely light, I'll think I hear something, not humming, just a child laughing far away, the way a sound carries over water on a still summer morning. I tell myself that one is real. We continue. My name is Marcus. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 3 years I've been working as a night security guard at Westfield Hollow, a large indoor shopping mall on the outskirts of the city. I won't say exactly which city, because anyone who knows this place would recognize the events I'm about to describe, and I'd rather not deal with that kind of attention. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. By the time I clock in, the stores are already closed, the cleaning crews are finishing their last sweep, and the food court workers are hauling out trash bags and pulling down metal shutters. Within about an hour of my arrival, the place is mine, or at least that's what I always assumed. Westfield Hollow is a 3-story mall with close to 200 stores, a movie theater on the top floor, and an indoor garden area on the ground level. The garden sits at the center of the west wing, and it has real trees, small ones, but real, plus a series of wooden benches with green metal frames and a decorative fountain in the middle. During the day, the fountain runs and people sit on the benches and eat their lunches and let their kids throw coins into the water. At night, the fountain shuts off and becomes just a shallow, still pool, and the lighting in the garden shifts from bright commercial white to a muted amber that makes everything look like an old photograph left too long in a drawer. I always liked the garden at night, actually. There was something honest about it. The whole mall is designed to make you want things, to feel a little restless, a little incomplete. But at 2 in the morning, all of that commercial urgency evaporates. And what you're left with is just a room with trees and benches and water that isn't moving. I found it peaceful most nights. There were 2 of us on the night shift, myself and a man named Dennis, who'd been working security at Westfield Hollow for 11 years before I ever arrived. Dennis covered the east wing, I covered the west. We did walkthroughs every hour and otherwise spent the quiet stretches in the security room, where we had access to roughly 80 cameras spread across the property. Dennis was a good person to work with, quiet, reliable, never dramatic. He made decent coffee and had a habit of doing crossword puzzles on his phone between rounds. We got along fine. For the first year and a half, nothing unusual ever happened on my shift. The most memorable incident I'd had was catching two teenagers who'd snuck in through a ventilation access near the east parking garage and set themselves up in a mattress store to sleep onto the display beds. I found them around 1 a.m., called the police, waited for them to be picked up and filed a report. That was genuinely the most exciting night I'd had, until the woman on bench 14 appeared. Bench 14 is the long wooden bench positioned directly in front of the fountain in the center of the garden area. The benches are numbered on small metal plates bolted to their frames, part of the mall's maintenance system, so the cleaning logs can reference specific locations. Bench 14 is the most visible one. If you're sitting on it, the fountain is directly in front of you, and the main corridor is at your back. It was a Tuesday night in late October when I first saw her on the monitor. I was running my standard camera sweep, going through each feed in sequence, looking for anything that seemed off. I reached camera 14, which covers the garden area from a wide angle mounted high on the south wall, and there she was, an elderly woman, somewhere around 70 years old, sitting upright on bench 14. She was wearing a long grey coat, her white hair pinned back neatly, and she had what appeared to be a canvas shopping bag resting on her lap. Her hands were folded over the top of the bag. She was looking at the fountain. I checked the timestamp on the feed, 2:47 a.m. My first thought was simple. She must have been missed at closing, fallen asleep somewhere and only woken up recently. It happened. I'd heard of it happening at other malls too. Someone dozes off in a quiet corner of a bookstore. A staff member does a visual sweep without looking closely enough, and by the time the last employee locks up, there's still a customer inside. Not ideal, but not exactly an emergency either. I got up, grabbed my radio, and walked from the security room to the garden. It took me about 4 minutes, maybe closer to 5, because I stopped to check the service corridor near the restrooms on the way. When I arrived at the garden, bench 14 was empty. I stood there for a moment and looked around. The corridor behind me was dark and silent. The stores on either side had their shutters down. The fountain pool reflected the amber light without moving. There was nowhere for a woman in a grey coat to have gone in the time it took me to walk from the security room to the garden. She would have had to pass me in the corridor, and I would have seen her. I checked the nearby restrooms. I walked the full perimeter of the garden. I looked behind the planters and along the maintenance access door at the north end. Nothing. When I got back to the security room, I rewound the footage. She was there on the recording exactly as I'd seen her, sitting on bench 14 in her grey coat, hands folded over the canvas bag, perfectly still, facing the fountain. She sat that way from 2:47 until 3:01 a.m., and then at 3:01 and 14 seconds she was simply gone. No getting up, no walking away. The camera feed didn't cut or corrupt. She was present in one frame and absent in the next. I played it back 3 times. Then I walked over to Dennis's station and showed him. He watched it quietly, twice through, then rubbed the back of his neck and said, "Huh." He handed my phone back. "That is strange." I waited for him to say something else. "Probably a camera thing," he said, and turned back to his crossword. I didn't push it, but I noticed something in the way he said it flat, careful, the way a person sounds when they're choosing not to say the real thing. I told myself it was a one-time anomaly, a sensor issue, a rogue reflection, a combination of tired eyes and low light playing tricks on the footage. I told myself that convincingly enough to sleep reasonably well for the next 6 days. Then the following Tuesday at 2:47 a.m. she was there again. Same bench, same grey coat, same white hair, same canvas bag, same upright posture, same unmoving gaze, fixed on the still water of the fountain. And when I arrived downstairs, the bench was empty, and I found no trace of her. I began logging it. Every Tuesday, same time, same location. Over the following 3 weeks, I documented the appearances on camera 14, cross-referenced them with camera 22, a secondary maintenance camera mounted on a column near the fountain that provides a side-angle view of bench 14, and found something that unsettled me more than the appearances themselves. Camera 22 showed nothing. The bench was empty on that feed every time, without exception. 2 cameras, same physical space, same moment in time. One showed her clearly, the other showed an empty bench. I asked the building maintenance team to inspect both cameras. They did a full diagnostic and found no faults in either system. The cameras were functioning normally. They had been for years. There was no explanation for the discrepancy. I spent a Tuesday night with a notepad making notes about what I could observe on camera 14. The rhythm of her breathing. Her shoulders rose and fell at regular intervals, slowly. The occasional movement of her right hand dipping into the canvas bag and making a small, outward scattering gesture, as though she were throwing seed to birds. There were no birds in the mall. There were never birds inside the mall. The scattering motion was deliberate and unhurried, the motion of someone engaged in a familiar, comforting routine. By the 5th week, I stopped trying to explain it and started trying to talk to her. On the 6th Tuesday at 2:45 a.m., I was already in the garden, sitting on the bench adjacent to bench 14, facing the fountain. At 2:47, she was there. I didn't startle, and neither did she. She arrived the same way she always did, no approach, no footsteps, no gradual appearance. She was simply present, the way a word arrives in your mind before you've consciously thought it. She sat with her back straight and her bag on her lap, and she looked at the fountain, and I sat 2 feet away and looked at the fountain as well, and for a few minutes neither of us said anything. "Nice night," I finally said. She turned to look at me. Her eyes were very dark and very calm, and she looked at me the way you look at someone when you've been waiting a long time for them to decide to speak. "It's always nice at this hour," she said. Her voice was quiet and clear, with a slight accent I couldn't fully place. "No one rushing anywhere. Everyone who needs to be somewhere is already there." "That's a good way to put it," I said. "I've had time to think about it," she said. I asked her if she came here often. She gave me a look that was almost amused, the look of a woman who finds politeness endearing in its limitations, and said that she came to wait. "For what?" I asked. She reached into the canvas bag and made the scattering motion. I heard it this time, a faint, dry rustle like seeds moving through fingers. "For my granddaughter," she said. "She said she'd meet me here. We were going to look at things together. She needed something nice for the season." A pause. "She was always late. I used to be annoyed by it. I'm not anymore." We sat in silence for a while after that. The amber light reflected off the fountain pool, and the ventilation system murmured somewhere above us. And I watched her make the scattering motion twice more before she turned back to the water and seemed to close herself off in some gentle, private way. At 3:01, she was gone. I sat on that bench for the next 4 Tuesdays in a row. We talked more as the weeks went on. Not about anything heavy, not at first. She told me she liked the tall ceilings of the mall. They reminded her of old railway stations, of a time when public spaces were built to make you feel small in a good way, in the way that reminded you the world was larger than your own concerns. She told me the fountain would look better with some greenery around the base, some ferns or trailing plants. She told me she'd always kept a garden and that she missed it. In an offhand way that suggested the missing was old and had grown manageable, I asked her once what was in the bag. "Birdseed," she said, as though that were perfectly obvious. "Right," I said. She looked at me sideways, and there it was again, that contained quiet amusement. "You don't see them?" she said. It wasn't a question. "No," I said. "That doesn't mean they're not here," she said. "It just means you're looking at the wrong things." And she made the scattering motion again, and the dry rustle of the seed filled the silence between us. It was around this point that I went to Dennis. I described everything, the appearances on camera 14, the discrepancy with camera 22, the 6 weeks of Tuesday night visits, the conversations. I described her grey coat and white hair and the canvas bag and the way she threw seed to birds I couldn't see. I watched Dennis's face while I talked. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look skeptical. He looked like a man who has been waiting a long time for a conversation he'd hoped to avoid. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the table between us. "Her name was Agnes," he said finally. He told me that about 4 years ago a woman had a heart attack in the mall, in the garden area. She'd been sitting on bench 14 waiting for her granddaughter. They'd planned a shopping trip for the granddaughter's birthday, and Agnes had arrived early and was waiting on the bench. The granddaughter, a woman in her early 30s named Emma, had texted to say she'd be late. There was an accident on the highway backing up traffic badly. Agnes had texted back, "Take your time, sweetheart. I'll be here. I have the pigeons to keep me company." She had apparently always carried birdseed in her bag and fed the pigeons in the park near her apartment. It was a habit she kept even in places where there were no pigeons to receive it. The maintenance crew found Agnes collapsed on bench 14 approximately 40 minutes after Emma's last text. They called the paramedics. By the time Emma arrived at the mall she'd parked and was running through the entrance, Agnes had already been taken away. Emma learned what had happened from the security desk. Agnes died in the hospital that evening without regaining consciousness. She never knew that Emma had come. Dennis had been on shift that day covering for a colleague, and he'd watched Emma sit down on bench 14 for a while by herself, in the aftermath of it all, before someone came to take her home. He said she looked like a person who had been interrupted midway through a sentence and would spend a long time trying to remember what she'd meant to say. After that, Dennis said, she came back every Tuesday for a while, sat on the bench for 20 minutes, half an hour, didn't buy anything, just sat, and then stopped coming about a year ago. I heard she moved. He paused. I don't know where. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. He looked at me steadily. Because I knew you'd go down there, he said. And I thought that was probably okay, just that I didn't want to be the one to send you. I understood that. I think I understood it better than I could have said. The last time I saw Agnes was in early December. The mall had been decorated for Christmas garlands along the corridors, a tree in the central atrium, the kind of warm, dense commercial festivity that fills a building with light. Even after closing, even in the amber dimness of the off hours, the decorations gave the place a different quality. Less like a space that was waiting for tomorrow, more like a space that had made peace with the night. I arrived at the garden at 2:45 and sat on my bench. At 2:47, Agnes appeared. But something had shifted. She wasn't looking at the fountain. She was looking at me directly, from the first moment, as though she'd known exactly where I'd be and had arrived specifically for that reason, rather than out of some endless unresolved waiting. Her expression was different too. It was the expression of someone who has completed something they'd been working on for a very long time and is now allowing themselves to rest. You've been kind, she said, no preamble. I haven't done much, I said. You came back, she said. You kept coming back. That was enough. That was more than you know. We sat for a while. The Christmas lights on the upper balcony cast a faint warm glow down into the garden, and the ventilation hummed somewhere above, and the fountain pool lay still and dark and perfectly quiet. Then she said, She came, you know, my Emma, she was here the same day. I know, I said. Dennis told me. Agnes nodded slowly. I was very angry for a long time, she said. I know that might be hard to understand, but I was sitting on this bench and I was waiting and then nothing, and the anger made everything very small. It took me a while to see past it. She looked at the fountain. She was only 40 minutes late. 40 minutes is nothing. 40 minutes is a slow cup of coffee. She came, I said. She came, Agnes agreed. She made the scattering motion one last time, unhurried and gentle, and the dry sound of the birdseed moved through the quiet air. Tell her I know, she said. If you ever find a way to tell her I know she came and that I'm not waiting anymore and that she shouldn't either. I'll try, I said. She smiled. It was a warm, full smile, the smile of someone who has been holding something heavy and has finally set it down in the right place. And then at 3:01 a.m., the same as always, she was gone. Camera 14 recorded her presence that night until the end. Camera 22 showed an empty bench. Both of those things are documented in the system's archive, if anyone ever thinks to look. I haven't seen her since. I still work at Westfield Hollow. My shift still starts at 10 p.m. I still drink too much coffee and argue with Dennis about radio stations and do my walkthroughs every hour without fail. On Tuesday nights, I still end up in the garden around 2:47, sitting on the adjacent bench, looking at bench 14, looking at the fountain. The bench is empty every time. The camera agrees. I stay for about 15 minutes and then I go back to the security room, and the rest of the night passes the way nights pass everywhere. I did try to find Emma. I went through the mall's old incident records, found the report from the day Agnes was taken away, and worked from there, slowly, carefully, the way you work when you're not sure you have the right to be doing what you're doing. I found a social media profile that seemed right. A woman in her early 30s, living in another city, who posted photos of her garden and her neighborhood, and Once a photo of a bench in a city park with no caption at all. I sent her a message. I kept it short. I told her I worked at the mall, that I'd heard about her grandmother through a long-time colleague, that I thought about the story often. I told her I believed for reasons I couldn't fully explain and wouldn't try to, that Agnes knew, that she had always known, even then, that Emma had come, that whatever had kept Agnes tethered to that bench wasn't anger, and it wasn't blame, and it had finally found its way to something that looked a lot like peace. I never received a reply. I didn't expect one. But about 2 weeks after I sent it, on a Tuesday afternoon, someone left a small bundle of wildflowers on bench 14. The cleaning crew found them during the morning rounds the following day and disposed of them the way cleaning crews dispose of things that don't belong, efficiently, without sentiment. I saw them on camera 14 before they were taken, just sitting there on the bench tied with a piece of kitchen twine. Nobody on any of the other feeds had left them. Whatever camera caught the person who placed them, if it was a person, that footage wasn't something I ever found. I don't have an explanation for any of this. I'm not someone who needs one. I'm a man who sits in a room watching cameras for 8 hours a night, and I know the difference between something I can account for and something I can't. What happened at bench 14 falls firmly into the second category, and I've come to believe that's where it belongs. Agnes was a real woman who sat on a bench and waited, and the waiting continued past the point where the waiting should have been able to continue. And one Tuesday night in early December, in a mall decorated for Christmas, the waiting ended. I'd like to think the flowers reached her. I'd like to think she felt them placed there, the same way she once felt the pigeons she couldn't see arrive to eat from her hand.